The most important truths in history were never spoken during press conferences or courtroom testimonies. They were whispered in hospital beds, mumbled to a nurse, scrawled in a letter that wouldn't be opened for decades, or admitted only at the penalty of death. Because here's what people often don't realize. The dying have nothing left to lose. And secrets, it turns out, are heavier than coffins. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time of day is it there? Morning? On a commute to work? Or a very late night? Tonight's episode is different from most. We're not following one dynasty or one empire. We're following a pattern. The pattern of what happens when people who were there, who saw what really happened, who carried secrets for decades, finally decide to speak. Not to journalists, not to prosecutors, but to the people sitting beside their bed in the final hours. And there's something the science tells us about that. Dr. James Pennebaker has spent over 4 decades studying what happens when people externalize suppressed thoughts. Across more than 400 studies, his research consistently shows that the act of writing down what's burdening you, not analyzing it, not solving it, just getting it out of your head and onto paper, measurably reduces psychological and physiological stress. A study at Baylor University took this further. They found that spending just 5 minutes before bed writing down unfinished tasks to get them off their mind helped participants fall asleep faster than those who wrote about tasks they'd already completed. 9 minutes from 5 minutes of writing. So before we begin tonight, take a moment. Whatever's sitting in your mind right now, the unfinished conversation, the thing you keep meaning to do, the worry you've been carrying around like loose change in your pocket, write it down. Think of it as your own small confession. No judgment, no audience. Just release. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers and let the next story find you when you least expect it. Amsterdam, 1945. World War II is over, but the reckoning has just begun. In a Dutch courtroom, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and trembling hands stands accused of one of the most despicable crimes a Dutchman could commit in the aftermath of Nazi occupation. Collaboration. Specifically, selling a priceless national treasure, a painting by Johannes Vermeer, one of the Netherlands' most revered old masters, to Hermann Goering himself. The Reichsmarshal, Hitler's second-in-command, the man who looted Europe's cultural heritage with the enthusiasm of a collector and the authority of a conqueror. The painting in question was Christ and the Adulteress. Vermeer, authenticated by the world's leading experts, purchased by Goering for the equivalent of millions. And the man who sold it to him is Han van Meegeren. The charge is treason. The penalty is death. Van Meegeren looks at the judges. He looks at the prosecutors who have built their case on a foundation of authenticated expertise and national outrage. He looks at the press gallery, packed with journalists who have already written the headline, "Dutch traitor sold national treasure to Nazis." And then he says 6 words that turn the entire courtroom upside down. I didn't sell a Vermeer. Silence. I painted it. The courtroom erupts. The prosecutors scramble. The art experts, the very people who had authenticated the painting as a genuine 17th century masterpiece, turn pale. Van Meegeren isn't just confessing to forgery. He's confessing to a career of forgery. Multiple paintings, multiple sales. Years of deception that fooled the most sophisticated art market in the world. And his confession isn't driven by guilt or conscience. It's driven by survival. Because if the paintings are forgeries, then he didn't sell Dutch cultural treasures to the Nazis. He swindled them. He took Goering's money for fakes. And in post-war Netherlands, swindling a Nazi isn't treason. It's practically heroism. But the court isn't convinced. Anyone can claim to be a forger. Prove it, they say. And what happens next? Well, we'll save that for later. Because the full story of Han van Meegeren is, without exaggeration, the most extraordinary deathbed confession in history. Trondheim, Norway, 1977. Picture a city carved into the edge of a fjord where the winter dark arrives in October and doesn't fully retreat until March. A university town, quiet streets, the kind of place where violent crime doesn't just make the news, it shatters the community's understanding of itself. 2 young women have been murdered. The killings are savage, senseless, and terrifyingly close together. The city is gripped by fear. Parents won't let their children walk home from school. The police are under enormous pressure. The public doesn't want explanations. They want an arrest. And the police find their man. His name is Fritz Moen. He's in his 30s. He lives alone. He works menial jobs. He has a criminal record, a previous conviction for a minor sexual offense that, in the eyes of investigators, makes him a plausible suspect for something far worse. But there's something else about Fritz Moen. Something that should have made every investigator, every prosecutor, every judge pause before building a case against him. Fritz Moen is deaf. Profoundly deaf. And he has a severe speech impediment that makes verbal communication nearly impossible. Now, consider what that means in the context of a criminal investigation. The interrogation room, that crucible where guilt and innocence are supposedly separated through the alchemy of questioning, depends entirely on language, on the ability to ask, to answer, to challenge, to explain. To say, I didn't do this, in a way that registers as conviction rather than evasion. Fritz Moen couldn't do any of that. What the police got from him was something. Fragments, partial statements that investigators interpreted as confessions. Words squeezed from a man who could barely produce them, shaped by questions he may not have fully understood, delivered through an interpreter whose accuracy would later be questioned by every legal scholar who reviewed the case. But in 1977, it was enough. It was enough because the city needed it to be enough. Because the alternative, admitting they had no viable suspect, was unacceptable. Fritz Moen was convicted of murder, then convicted again for the second murder. 2 life sentences for a deaf man who had spent the entire legal process trapped inside a system designed for people who could hear and speak. Think about that for a moment. Not just the injustice, the architecture of the injustice. Every element of due process assumes a defendant who can participate in their own defense. The right to hear the charges against you, the right to cross-examine witnesses, the right to testify on your own behalf, the right to communicate with your attorney in real time. Fritz Moen had none of these rights in any meaningful sense. He had the appearance of these rights, the formality, the checkbox, but the substance was as silent as Fritz himself. 18 years? That's how long Fritz Moen spent in prison for crimes he did not commit. 18 years of waking up in a cell, surrounded by a world of sound he couldn't access, convicted by words he couldn't produce, in a system that had decided his silence was guilt. And here's where the story becomes something worse than tragic. It becomes institutional. Because people tried to reopen the case. Lawyers, advocates, journalists who noticed the cracks in the evidence. They pointed to the interrogation methods. They pointed to the interpreter's qualifications. They pointed to the physical evidence that didn't match Moen's capabilities. And the system resisted. Not because individual judges or prosecutors were evil, but because institutions have a survival instinct that operates independently of any individual's conscience. Reopening the Moen case didn't just mean admitting a mistake, it meant indicting the system. The interrogation procedures, the prosecutorial judgment, the appellate review process, the entire machinery of justice that had processed Fritz Moen's life and produced a wrong answer. Every person who had touched the case, the detectives, the prosecutors, the judges, had built a piece of their professional reputation on the conviction. Overturning it didn't just free Fritz Moen, it retroactively marked every one of them. And so the case remained closed. Year after year, appeal after appeal denied. Fritz Moen was released from prison in 1996. Not exonerated, released. There's a difference that matters enormously, and it mattered most to Fritz. Released means, we're letting you go. Exonerated means, we were wrong. The system could manage the first. The second was harder. Fritz Moen died in the year 2000. He died without hearing the words he'd spent his entire adult life unable to speak for himself. You are innocent. Those words came later. In 2004 and 2006, Fritz Moen was posthumously exonerated of both murders. The real killer had been identified, partly through DNA evidence, partly through advances in forensic science, and partly through something far more human than technology. A deathbed confession. Another man, years after Moen had already died, admitted to the killings. Not in a courtroom, not to investigators. In the diminished, vulnerable space of his final days, when the weight of what he'd done and what he'd allowed to happen to someone else became too heavy to carry any further, the Norwegian government eventually paid compensation to Fritz Moen's family. The case is now studied in law schools as Norway's worst miscarriage of justice. Reforms were implemented. Procedures were changed. But here's what sticks with me. Not the injustice itself. Injustice is, sadly, common. What sticks is the timing. Fritz Moen spent 18 years in prison. He spent 4 more years free, but not exonerated. He died. And then the truth arrived. Justice didn't fail Fritz Moen because the system was malicious. It failed him because the system operates on institutional time, not human time. And institutional time moves at the speed of reputation management, not at the speed of suffering. Fritz Moen couldn't speak his innocence, but across an ocean, another man faced a different kind of silencing, not by disability, but by design. There's a particular kind of cruelty in an accusation that can't be disproven. Not because it's true, but because the very nature of the claim makes skepticism feel like complicity. Father Kobilovich understood this, not in the abstract, not as a concept studied in seminary. He understood it the way you understand a knife after it's already inside you. He was a parish priest, not famous, not powerful, not connected to the kinds of institutional machinery that could shield him from what was coming. He was, by most accounts, exactly what you'd hope a parish priest would be: present, conscientious, genuinely invested in the people who sat in his pews every Sunday. And then one of those people destroyed him. The accusation came from a parishioner. The details were specific enough to be damaging, vague enough to be unverifiable, and devastating enough that even the whisper of them changed the temperature of every room Father Kobilovich walked into. Now, here's what most people don't understand about accusations within institutional frameworks, like the Catholic Church. The institution's response isn't primarily about truth, it's about risk. Consider the calculus from the Church's perspective. If the accusation is true, and the Church defends the priest, the institution faces catastrophic reputational damage. If the accusation is false, and the Church investigates thoroughly, the process itself generates publicity that damages both the priest and the institution. The only risk-minimizing strategy is distance. Immediate, visible, unambiguous distance. And so the Church did what institutions do. It stepped back, not all at once, not dramatically. Institutions rarely slam doors. They just stop opening them. Calls go unreturned. Support becomes conditional. The language shifts from our priest to the accused. The community that Kobilovich had served begins to reorganize itself around his absence, the way water closes over a stone. Father Kobilovich found himself fighting on two fronts simultaneously. The first was the accusation itself, the legal and canonical process of responding to claims that, by their nature, cast the accused as monstrous. The second was the institutional abandonment, the slow realization that the Church he'd dedicated his life to had decided that his innocence was less important than its own survival. And this is the part that's hardest to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. The isolation. An accused priest doesn't just lose his reputation, he loses his purpose. The daily structure of parish life, the masses, the confessions, the hospital visits, the community events, all of it evaporates. What remains is empty time, and the corrosive awareness that people you counseled, comforted, and served now cross the street to avoid you. Years passed, not days, not weeks, years of this particular kind of purgatory. Father Kobilovich existed in a space between guilt and innocence, where the system had no mechanism for resolution. The investigation produced no definitive finding. The accusation hung in the air, like smoke, never quite clearing. And then, in the way that these stories always seem to resolve, not through investigation or institutional courage, but through the peculiar honesty that proximity to death sometimes produces, the truth emerged. The accuser, on their deathbed, confessed. The entire thing had been fabricated. Every detail, every claim, every carefully constructed element of the accusation that had dismantled a man's life and career and calling. Fabricated. Now, I want you to sit with that word for a moment, because fabricated sounds clean, clinical, like an error in a spreadsheet that can be corrected with a keystroke. But what does fabricated actually mean in this context? It means that every night, Father Kobylovitz lay awake questioning his own sanity was unnecessary. Every sideways glance from a former parishioner was based on nothing. Every door that closed, every friendship that evaporated, every moment of institutional betrayal was the product of one person's deliberate lie. And here's the cruelest part. The deathbed confession that vindicated Father Kobylovitz is structurally identical to the deathbed confession we just heard about Fritz Moen. In both cases, the truth arrived after the damage was irreversible. In both cases, the institution's response, the investigation, the procedures, the formal acknowledgement of error came in institutional time, not human time. But there's a difference. Fritz Moen was silenced by disability. Father Kobylovitz was silenced by design. The accusation itself was engineered to be unanswerable, not because it was true, but because the social dynamics around such accusations make questioning them feel morally dangerous. The accuser understood something about power that most people never have to learn. The most devastating weapon isn't violence, it isn't money, it isn't political influence. It's an accusation that puts the burden of proof on the accused while making the very act of defense look like evidence of guilt. Father Kobylovitz was eventually vindicated, but vindication, in cases like this, is a complicated word. It means the record was corrected. It doesn't mean the years were returned. It doesn't mean the relationships were restored. It doesn't mean the damage was undone. It means the institution said, "We were wrong," which, as Fritz Moen's family can tell you, is something institutions find almost physically painful to do. If Father Kobylovich's story reveals what happens when an institution chooses self-preservation over truth, then what happens when the institution is the one committing the crime? February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom, Washington Heights, New York City. Malcolm X steps to the podium. He's 39 years old. He's been receiving death threats for months. His house was firebombed just a week earlier. He knows that forces are aligned against him. What he doesn't know, what he can't know, is that some of those forces are wearing badges. The ballroom is packed. 400 people, maybe more, pressed into a space that smells of floor polish and expectation. Malcolm's Organization of African American Unity has been gaining momentum, and his recent pivot from the rigid separatism of the Nation of Islam to a more inclusive, internationally connected vision of Black liberation has made him simultaneously more dangerous and more vulnerable. More dangerous to the institutions that preferred him as a caricature. More vulnerable because he'd broken with the Nation of Islam, the organization that had given him a platform, a community, and, as it turned out, a measure of protection. What happens next takes less than 2 minutes. A disturbance in the crowd. A man jumps up, shouting. The crowd turns. And in that moment of manufactured chaos, 3 men rush the stage with weapons drawn. Malcolm X is hit 21 times. He's pronounced dead at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital at 3:30 in the afternoon. Within days, 3 men are arrested: Muhammad Aziz, Khalil Islam, and Mujahid Abdul Halim, the only one whose gun was recovered at the scene, the only one who actually admitted to participating in the assassination. Halim, from the beginning, said Aziz and Islam were not involved. He named other accomplices. He was ignored. Aziz and Islam were convicted anyway. They would spend a combined 55 years in prison. Khalil Islam would die in 2009, still officially a convicted assassin, 16 years before the system would admit he had nothing to do with it. Now, this is where most people think the story ends. 3 men convicted. Case closed. The system processed a famous murder and produced a verdict. But there was a 4th man, and his story wouldn't emerge for more than half a century. His name was Ray Wood, and he was a New York City police officer. Specifically, he was an undercover officer assigned to infiltrate civil rights organizations. This was standard practice in the 1960s. The FBI's COINTELPRO program and the NYPD's own intelligence units had been penetrating black organizations for years, mapping their networks, identifying their leaders, and in some cases, actively working to destabilize them. Ray Wood's assignment put him inside the organizations surrounding Malcolm X. He was trusted. He had access. And according to the letter, he would leave behind, the letter that wouldn't become public until 2021, he played a specific role in what happened at the Audubon Ballroom. According to Wood's account, he was tasked with ensuring that Malcolm X's security detail, the men who normally checked attendees for weapons at the door, was neutralized before the assassination. Wood claims he arranged for key security personnel to be arrested on minor charges in the days before the event, effectively removing the last line of defense between Malcolm X and his killers. Think about what that means. If Wood's account is accurate, and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office found it credible enough to contribute to the 2021 exoneration of Aziz and Islam, then the New York City Police Department didn't just fail to prevent Malcolm X's assassination. It helped make it possible. Ray Wood carried this for decades, not just the knowledge of what he'd done, but the knowledge of what his silence had cost. 3 men convicted, 2 of them innocent. 55 years of imprisonment built on a foundation that Wood knew from the very first day was rotten. Why didn't he speak sooner? That's the question everyone asks. And it's the wrong question. The right question is, what kept him silent? And the answer is the same answer that appears in almost every story we're telling tonight. The institution. Ray Wood was a police officer. His career, his pension, his safety, and quite possibly his life depended on the continued silence of everyone involved. Speaking up didn't just mean confessing to his own role. It meant accusing the NYPD of complicity in the assassination of one of the most significant figures in American history. That's not a confession you make at a press conference. That's a confession you make when you have nothing left to lose. And so Ray Wood did what the guilty do when the institution is bigger than their conscience. He waited. He carried it, year after year, as Aziz and Islam sat in prison cells as investigators and journalists circled the case without finding the final piece as the official narrative hardened into accepted history. Ray Wood carried it. His letter, written to his family, intended for posthumous release, wasn't a burst of conscience. It was a carefully constructed document. He named names. He described procedures. He connected his actions to a broader institutional framework that extended well beyond his individual assignment. When the letter finally became public in 2021, it didn't arrive in a vacuum. A reinvestigation was already underway, driven by new evidence and the tireless advocacy of the Innocence Project. But Wood's letter provided something that evidence alone cannot: testimony from the inside. In November 2021, Mohammed Aziz and the estate of Khalil Islam were officially exonerated. The judge who vacated the convictions called the case a failure of the justice system. The city eventually paid a settlement of $26 million. But here's what stays with me. The settlement, the exoneration, the formal acknowledgement of error, all of this arrived in institutional time. Khalil Islam died in 2009. He never heard the words, "You are innocent." He died as a convicted assassin, and the system that convicted him took 12 more years to admit it was wrong. Mohammed Aziz was 83 years old when he was exonerated. He'd spent 20 years in prison and another 35 years living as a convicted murderer. His entire adult life, from his mid-20s until his early 80s, was defined by a crime he didn't commit. And Ray Wood? He got his peace. He made his confession. He died. That's the asymmetry at the heart of every deathbed confession. The confessor gets release. Everyone else gets more work to do. 3 stories in, and you might think deathbed confessions only emerge from the gravest corners of human experience. But sometimes, the secret isn't a murder or a conspiracy. Sometimes, it's a clock. And that's the thing about institutional time versus human time. We talk about justice as if it's a force of nature, like gravity, something that inevitably pulls toward truth. But it's not. Justice is a bureaucratic process. It moves at the speed of paperwork, political will, and reputational calculus. Fritz Moen's story isn't just about one man's suffering. It's about a system that discovered it had built its credibility on a foundation of coerced testimony from a man who couldn't even hear the questions being asked. And rather than tear that foundation apart, which would have meant admitting the entire structure was compromised, the system chose to let an innocent man rot. The Norwegian Parliament eventually recommended that 3 Supreme Court justices be impeached for their handling of the case. 3 Supreme Court justices, the highest judicial authority in the country, had participated in the machinery that ground Fritz Moen to dust. And even after his posthumous exoneration, the political system had to formally acknowledge that the judicial system had failed at its most fundamental task. But Fritz never knew any of that. He died believing the world believed he was a murderer. He died with 18 years of someone else's guilt pressed against his chest. And the man who actually committed those crimes, he got something Fritz never did. He got to choose when the truth came out. He got to die on his own terms, with his confession timed to his convenience, not Fritz's. That's the asymmetry that makes this story unbearable. The guilty man controlled the narrative to the very end. The innocent man never controlled anything. And consider something else. The language barrier that trapped Fritz Moen wasn't accidental. It wasn't a one-off procedural failure. It was a structural vulnerability in the system itself. A system designed by people who could hear, for people who could hear, tested by people who could hear. Fritz Moen didn't fall through the cracks. The system was built without a flaw for people like him. Norway's response was, to its credit, more thorough than most countries would have managed. The investigation into the investigation was exhaustive. The reforms were substantive. The compensation, while meaningless in any human sense, was at least formally offered. But here's what the reforms couldn't fix. They couldn't go back to 1977 and put a qualified sign language interpreter in that interrogation room. They couldn't replay the trial with a judge who understood that Fritz Moen's inability to communicate wasn't evidence of guilt. It was evidence that the entire proceeding was fundamentally unfair. They couldn't give Fritz back the 18 years he spent staring at the walls of a cell, convicted by words he couldn't produce and testimony he couldn't challenge. Reforms always arrive in the future tense. Fritz Moen's suffering existed in the past tense, and no amount of institutional improvement can bridge that gap. So when Father Kobilovich stood in the wreckage of his own life, falsely accused, abandoned by the institution he'd served, waiting for a truth that would only emerge from his accuser's deathbed, he was living in a version of the same story. Different country, different circumstances, same architecture of injustice. The accuser in Kobilovich's case understood something instinctive about institutional dynamics. They understood that certain accusations create their own gravitational field. Once launched, they don't need evidence to sustain them. They sustain themselves through the social physics of risk aversion. Consider the Church's position. Not as a moral institution, let's set that aside for a moment, but as an organization with assets, reputation, and liability exposure. When an accusation of this nature surfaces, the institution faces an asymmetric risk profile. If the accused is guilty and the institution defended them, the reputational damage is catastrophic. If the accused is innocent and the institution investigated cautiously, the reputational cost is manageable. So what does a risk-minimizing institution do? It distances. It takes the matter seriously. It cooperates fully. And in the process, it abandons the individual at the center of the accusation, regardless of guilt or innocence. Father Kobilovich wasn't destroyed by his accuser. He was destroyed by his institution's response to his accuser. The accusation was the match. The Church's risk calculus was the gasoline. And the years that followed were a particular kind of torture, not the dramatic suffering of a Fritz Moen locked in a cell. Something quieter, more corrosive. The daily experience of existing in a community that has been told something monstrous about you and has been given no reason to disbelieve it. Imagine it. The parishioners who used to stop him after Mass for conversation, who sought his counsel, who trusted him with their confessions. Now they look away. Or, worse, they look at him differently, with the kind of careful attention you give to something you've been warned about. The warmth is gone. What replaces it is a watchfulness that feels to the person being watched indistinguishable from accusation. And Kobilovich had no mechanism for defense that didn't make him look worse. Because here's the cruel genius of the accusation. Defending yourself too vigorously looks like someone with something to hide. Defending yourself calmly looks like someone who doesn't take the matter seriously. Not defending yourself looks like admission. There's no correct response to a fabricated accusation within an institutional framework. Every door leads to the same room. When the deathbed confession finally came, when his accuser admitted, in those final hours, that every word had been invented, the vindication should have felt like oxygen, like sunlight after years underground. But vindication is a strange kind of gift when it arrives too late. It corrects the record. It doesn't correct the experience. Father Kobilovich got his name back. But the years of isolation, the professional destruction, the faith crisis that comes from being abandoned by the institution you've dedicated your life to, those don't unwind, because someone finally told the truth. Now, the Malcolm X story operates at an entirely different scale, but the architecture is identical. An institution, in this case, the NYPD, chose self-preservation over justice, and the cost was measured in decades of wrongful imprisonment. What makes Raywood's case particularly shattering is the specificity of his role. He wasn't a passive observer. He wasn't someone who merely knew what happened and stayed silent. According to his own account, he was an active participant in creating the conditions for the assassination. Removing Malcolm X's security detail. Think about the operational precision of that. It's not the act of a rogue officer. It's the act of a system. Security details don't just disappear. They're arrested on specific charges at specific times to create a specific window of vulnerability that requires coordination, authorization, planning, and the implications of that planning extend far beyond Ray Wood's individual conscience. If Wood's account is accurate, then the NYPD's involvement in the Malcolm X assassination wasn't a failure of oversight. It was a use of oversight. The institution's surveillance and infiltration capabilities, tools ostensibly designed to protect public safety, were repurposed as tools of targeted elimination. The FBI's COINTELPRO program provides the broader context. Throughout the 1960s, the Bureau maintained a systematic campaign to infiltrate, disrupt, and neutralize civil rights organizations. The program's stated goal was to prevent the rise of a black messiah, J. Edgar Hoover's term for any black leader who might unify the movement. Malcolm X fit that description perfectly, especially after his break with the Nation of Islam, when his message evolved from separatism to something far more threatening to the status quo: international solidarity. Malcolm's post-Hajj vision, connecting the American civil rights struggle to global anti-colonial movements, made him a target not just of the Nation of Islam, but of federal institutions that saw any internationalization of black activism as a national security threat. And so, when Ray Wood lay dying, the secret he carried wasn't just about his own actions. It was about the system that deployed him, the institution that trained him, assigned him, and then spent 56 years hoping his silence would outlast his life. It almost did. Muhammad Aziz was 30 years old when he was convicted in 1966. He was 83 when he was exonerated in 2021. Do the math on that. 55 years, the entire span of an adult life, from young manhood to old age, defined by a crime that the NYPD knew he didn't commit. And Khalil Islam? He served 20 years in prison and died in 2009. He died 12 years before the system admitted it was wrong. He never heard the words. His family heard them. His legacy was corrected, but Khalil Islam went to his grave as a convicted assassin. The $26 million settlement that New York City eventually paid was, by any human accounting, an absurdity. Not because it was too much, because no amount of money maps onto 55 years of stolen life. It was the system's way of acknowledging error without acknowledging the full horror of what that error cost. And Ray Wood? He got his piece. He made his confession on his own timeline. He chose when the truth came out, and he chose a method, a letter to his family, that ensured he wouldn't have to face the consequences. That's the privilege of the confessor. The dying get to unburden themselves and leave. Everyone else inherits the mess. 3 stories, 3 institutions: the Norwegian justice system, the Catholic Church, the NYPD, that chose self-preservation over truth. 3 innocent parties: Fritz Moen, Father Kobilovich, Mohammed Aziz, and Khalil Islam, who paid the price for that choice in decades of suffering. And 3 confessions that arrived, as confessions always do, in the confessor's time. Not the victim's time, not justice's time, the confessor's time. But here's what I keep coming back to. When I think about these first 3 stories together, we talk about deathbed confessions as if they're acts of courage, as if the dying person has finally found the moral strength to tell the truth. And maybe that's partially true. Proximity to death does something. It recalibrates the cost-benefit analysis of honesty. When you have nothing left to lose, the cost of truth drops to 0. But the benefit doesn't drop to 0. The benefit, for the confessor, actually increases, because the deathbed confession isn't just about unburdening yourself. It's about controlling the narrative of your life one final time. It's about choosing which version of yourself survives. The real killer, in the Moen case, got to die as a man who came clean. Ray Wood got to die as a man who told the truth. These are flattering narratives. They recast the decades of silence, not as cowardice, but as burden. I carried this terrible secret, and the confession itself, as a kind of heroism. But Fritz Moen didn't get to choose his narrative. Father Kobilovich didn't get to choose his. Mohammed Aziz spent 55 years being narrated by someone else's silence. The deathbed confession looks like justice arriving. But look closer, and it's actually the final exercise of the confessor's power. The power to decide when truth matters. And that distinction between the confessor's comfort and the victim's suffering will appear in every story we tell tonight. Every single one. Now, as I said, sometimes the secret isn't a murder. Sometimes it isn't a conspiracy. Sometimes it's something so unexpected, so peculiar, so strangely beautiful in its own way, that you almost forget it's a crime at all. Sometimes it's a clock, not just any clock, the most famous timepiece ever made, a watch commissioned by a queen who would never live to see it completed, a watch that sat in a museum for decades before vanishing into the night, stolen by a man whose entire identity was built around understanding the mechanisms of time. But that's the next chapter. And I think you'll find it's a very different kind of confession. A clock so extraordinary that an unnamed admirer, widely believed to be Count Hans Axel von Fersen, the Swedish nobleman, rumored to have been Marie Antoinette's lover, commissioned it from Abraham Louis Breguet, the greatest watchmaker who ever lived. The commission came with a single instruction: spare no expense. Use every complication known to the art of horology. Make it the most magnificent timepiece the world had ever seen. Breguet accepted the commission in 1783. Marie Antoinette was executed in 1793. Breguet himself died in 1823. The watch, known as the Breguet number 160, or simply the Marie Antoinette, was finally completed by Breguet's son in 1827. 44 years in the making. A watch begun for a queen, finished for no one. A mechanical miracle sitting in the Al-Amaya Museum for Islamic Art in Jerusalem, a testament to human ambition outlasting human life. And then, in 1983, it vanished, along with over 100 other timepieces from the museum's collection. The theft was meticulous, professional, and completely unsolved for decades. The police investigated. Interpol was notified. The insurance company offered rewards. The horological world mourned. And the watches simply disappeared. Until a man named Norman Diller was dying, and his wife learned something about the collection in their home that she hadn't known before. Something that changed everything she thought she knew about the man she'd married. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning of Diller's story, not with the theft, but with the obsession that made the theft inevitable. Norman Diller was, by all outward appearances, exactly what he seemed: a clockmaker, a craftsman, a man who understood the delicate choreography of gears and springs and escapements, the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He lived in Tel Aviv, he ran a respected business, and he had a private collection that friends and clients admired without ever questioning its provenance. But there's a difference between a collector and an obsessive. A collector acquires things because they're beautiful, or rare, or valuable. An obsessive acquires things because they must. Because the object calls to something in them that can't be satisfied by looking through museum glass. Because ownership isn't about possession, it's about intimacy, about the tactile, private experience of holding something extraordinary and knowing it's yours. And Diller was an obsessive. Not in the way that raises alarms, not erratic, not compulsive, not visibly consumed. Quietly obsessive. Methodically obsessive. The kind of obsessive who builds a life around his fixation so naturally that no one ever suspects the fixation exists. He understood clocks not as objects, but as living mechanisms. He could hear their heartbeats. And when he encountered timepieces of extraordinary quality, the kind of work that represents the absolute pinnacle of human craftsmanship, something in him couldn't leave them behind glass. This is what makes the Jerusalem Museum theft different from ordinary heists. Most thieves steal for money. Diller stole for love. Not romantic love, the love of the maker for the made. The almost spiritual connection between a master craftsman and the work of another master. Diller didn't want to sell the Marie Antoinette watch. He wanted to hold it, to study its movements, to understand, through his fingertips, what Breguet had been thinking 2 centuries earlier. The theft happened in 1983, a Saturday night in April. The Al-Amaya Museum for Islamic Art sits in a quiet residential neighborhood in Jerusalem. Not the kind of place that screams high-security vault. It's a small, elegant museum dedicated to preserving Islamic art and artifacts. But its clock collection, donated by the British mathematician Sir David Lionel Salomons, was world-class. Over 100 timepieces, clocks, watches, automatons, each one a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. And at the center of the collection, the crown jewel, the Breguet number 160, the Marie Antoinette. The thief, or thieves, because the sophistication of the operation suggested planning that went beyond one person, bypassed the museum's security systems with almost contemptuous ease. No alarms triggered, no witnesses. The watches were removed carefully, professionally, by someone who understood their fragility and their value. When the museum staff arrived on Sunday morning, they found empty display cases and no leads. The Israeli police investigated. Interpol was notified. The Lloyds of London insurance underwriters offered a substantial reward. Art theft specialists around the world were consulted. Nothing. For 23 years, nothing. The watches had simply vanished. Into the collection of a man who lived in Tel Aviv, ran a clock repair business, and was known to his neighbors as a quiet, meticulous, slightly eccentric craftsman. Naaman Diller didn't fit the profile of a master thief. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't wealthy in any visible way. He didn't travel to Monaco or attend underground auctions. He was, in every observable dimension of his life, exactly what he appeared to be. A clockmaker who loved clocks. But obsession doesn't announce itself. It burrows. It builds rooms inside your life that no one else can see. And Diller had built an entire hidden wing. The watches lived with him, not in a safe deposit box or a climate-controlled vault. With him, in his workshop, in his home, integrated into the daily texture of his existence. He could pick up the Marie Antoinette watch and study its movement. He could hold a Breguet tourbillon and feel the mechanism pulse against his palm. He could understand, through direct physical contact, the genius of craftsmen who had been dead for 200 years. And that, I think, is what separates this story from every other art heist in history. Diller wasn't in it for the money. The watches were never offered for sale. They weren't ransomed. They weren't used as currency in some criminal underworld transaction. They were kept, treasured, maintained by a man who had the skills to care for them properly. Which raises an uncomfortable question, one that the legal system isn't designed to answer. Is theft still theft when the thief provides better care for the object than the institution it was stolen from? No, I'm not arguing. Diller was justified. Theft is theft. Cultural heritage belongs to the public. Full stop. But there's something in Diller's story that resists easy moral categorization. Because the museum had the watches behind glass, Diller had them in his hands. The museum preserved them as artifacts. Diller experienced them as mechanisms, as living things with beating hearts. The confession came the way these things always come. At the end, Naaman Diller was dying, and the weight of what he'd hidden became part of the weight his body could no longer carry. He told his wife, not everything, not at first, but enough. Enough for her to understand that the collection in their home wasn't what she'd always assumed it was. Enough for her to realize that the quiet clockmaker she'd married had been carrying a secret that connected him to one of Israel's most famous unsolved crimes. And here's the detail that elevates this from true crime curiosity to something genuinely strange and almost moving. Diller's will included instructions for the return of the watches. He didn't want them sold. He didn't want them hidden forever. He wanted them to go back. The man who stole them wanted them to go home. After Diller's death, his wife contacted the authorities. The watches were recovered, all of them, including the Marie Antoinette. They were in remarkable condition. Of course they were. They'd been maintained by a master clockmaker for over 2 decades. The Marie Antoinette watch returned to the L.A. Mayer Museum. It sits there now, behind glass, its mechanism ticking away the minutes of an existence that has spanned revolutions, executions, thefts, confessions, and returns. A watch commissioned for a queen who died before she could see it. Completed for an audience that didn't exist, stolen by a man who loved it too much, and returned by a deathbed confession that revealed the theft was never about greed. It was about intimacy, the private, possessive, ultimately destructive intimacy between a craftsman and the object of his obsession, a clockmaker who stole time. And in the end, time is what he ran out of. Now, if Diller's confession was about the love of an object, the almost sacred connection between maker and made, the next confession is about something far darker, about the things men do in the name of their country, about secrets kept not out of love, but out of training, and about what happens when a professional liar decides in his final hours to tell what might be the truth. E. Howard Hunt was many things. CIA operative, Bay of Pigs planner, Watergate burglar, convicted felon, spy novelist, and, in the final months of his life, a man with a story he wanted to tell. The story was about November 22nd, 1963. Dallas, Texas. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, I need to be careful here. Not because the subject is controversial. It is, obviously, ferociously controversial, but because E. Howard Hunt was a professional deceiver. His entire career was built on creating false narratives, managing disinformation, and executing covert operations. He was, by training and temperament, the exact kind of person whose deathbed confession should be received with maximum skepticism. And yet the specificity of what he claimed, the people he named, and the chain of command he described have a quality that's difficult to dismiss entirely. Not because they're necessarily true, but because they're internally consistent in a way that random fabrication rarely achieves. Let me tell you what Hunt said, and then you can decide what to make of it. Hunt's career in the CIA began in the late 1940s. By the time Kennedy was assassinated, Hunt had spent over a decade in the agency's clandestine services. He'd been involved in the overthrow of Guatemala's government in 1954. He'd helped plan the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, the operation whose failure, some historians argue, created the conditions for Kennedy's assassination. Because here's what most people don't fully appreciate about the Bay of Pigs. It wasn't just a failed military operation. It was a betrayal. At least from the CIA's perspective. The agency had planned the invasion. They'd trained the Cuban exiles. They'd built the infrastructure, and at the critical moment, President Kennedy refused to provide the air support that the agency believed was essential for success. The invasion collapsed. Over 1,000 Cuban exiles were captured. The CIA was humiliated, and within the agency, a narrative formed, not officially, not on paper, but in the corridors and the classified briefing rooms, that Kennedy had let them down. That he couldn't be trusted. That he was, in the parlance of the intelligence world, unreliable. Hunt was in the middle of all of this. He knew the players, he knew the grudges, and according to the recordings he made with his son, St. John Hunt, in the months before his death in January 2007, he knew something else. He claimed that Lyndon Baines Johnson, Kennedy's vice president and successor, was involved in the planning of the assassination. He named specific CIA operatives. He described what he called the big event, a term that, if Hunt is to be believed, was the internal designation for the operation. The recordings are remarkable not for what they prove nothing definitively, but for their tone. Hunt isn't ranting. He isn't emotional. He speaks with the flat, methodical precision of a man delivering an after-action report. Names, places, operational details. The kind of specifics that would be easy to verify or debunk if anyone had the access and the will to do so. St. John Hunt published portions of his father's account in Rolling Stone magazine. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Conspiracy theorists seized on it as vindication. Mainstream historians dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man with a complicated relationship to truth. The CIA declined to comment. And that's the paradox of E. Howard Hunt's confession. He was, by any measure, an unreliable narrator. A man who had spent his entire career lying for a living. A convicted criminal. Watergate. A man with enormous ego and a novelist's flair for dramatic narrative. But he was also a man who was there, who was inside the machinery, who had the proximity and the clearance to know things that no outsider could verify. And his confession arrived at the one moment when lying served no purpose, when he was weeks from death and had nothing left to gain from fabrication. Or did he? Because here's the thing about spies. Even on their deathbeds, they're still spies. The instinct to shape narrative, to control information, to leave behind the version of events that serves your interests, that doesn't vanish when the monitors start beeping. If anything, it intensifies. The deathbed is the last stage, and E. Howard Hunt was nothing if not a performer. So what do we make of it? The honest answer is, we don't know. We can't know. The JFK assassination exists in a twilight zone between documented history and institutional secrecy, where certainty is impossible and the absence of certainty is itself suspicious. What we can say is this. A man who spent his life inside the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world chose, in his final days, to put names and details on the record. He knew those details would be scrutinized, debated, and quite possibly dismissed. He said them anyway. Was it truth? Was it one final disinformation operation run by a dying spy against his own legacy? Was it a mixture of both? Real events filtered through decades of self-justification and ego? We'll never know for certain, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the lasting legacy of Hunt's confession isn't what it reveals about the JFK assassination. It's what it reveals about the nature of confession itself. Because if a professional liar tells you the truth on his deathbed, how would you know? Hunt claimed to know what happened to a president. But the next man claimed to know what happened to someone almost as famous. A man who vanished so completely that his name became a verb for disappearing. July 30th, 1975. A Wednesday. Detroit, Michigan. Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, arguably the most powerful labor leader in American history, a man who could make a phone call and shut down every truck route on the eastern seaboard, walked out of a restaurant called the Marchus Red Fox and was never seen again. For 48 years and counting, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa has been the most famous unsolved case in American criminal history. Hundreds of leads, dozens of suspects, multiple excavation sites underneath stadium bleachers in landfills, under highway overpasses. None of them produced a body. But according to one man, there is no body to find. Not anymore. Frank Sheeran, labor union official, World War II veteran, and alleged hitman for the Buffalino crime family, claimed in the years before his death in 2003 that he knew exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, because he was the one who did it. Sheeran's confession didn't come on a deathbed in the traditional sense. It came in a series of interviews with Charles Brandt, a former homicide prosecutor turned author, that were eventually published in the book I Heard You Paint Houses. The title comes from mob slang. Painting houses means killing people because the blood splatters the walls like paint. According to Sheeran, those were the first words Jimmy Hoffa ever said to him. Now, Sheeran's account, which Martin Scorsese turned into the 3.5-hour film The Irishman, starring Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci, is both extraordinarily detailed and impossibly unverifiable. He describes the day of the killing with the precision of someone reliving it, not reconstructing it. The phone call, the drive. The house on Balmoral Street in Detroit. A house that, according to Sheeran, had been selected specifically for the purpose. The moment Hoffa got in the car, trusting Sheeran because Sheeran was his friend, his confidant, the one person in the tangled web of organized crime and labor politics that Hoffa believed would never betray him. And that's the detail that makes this story unbearable, not the killing itself. Violence in organized crime is expected, even ritualized. What's unbearable is the betrayal of trust. Hoffa got in that car because he believed Sheeran was loyal, and Sheeran was loyal to the organization. The Buffalino family had decided that Hoffa was a problem. Hoffa's attempts to regain control of the Teamsters after his prison sentence threatened the mob's financial interests in the union's pension fund. And when the organization decides someone is a problem, someone solves the problem. Sheeran was that someone. And the fact that he was also Hoffa's friend wasn't a complication for the organization. It was the strategy. Because the only way to get Jimmy Hoffa into a car without his bodyguards, without his suspicion, without the hypervigilance that had kept him alive through decades of mob politics, was to send someone he trusted. According to Sheeran, he shot Hoffa twice, behind the right ear, in the foyer of the house on Balmoral Street. And then other men Men Sheeran claimed he didn't know, or wouldn't name, handled the body. The FBI partially corroborated Sheeran's account. Forensic analysis found biological evidence in the house on Balmoral Street consistent with what Sheeran described, but consistent with isn't confirmed by. And there are elements of Sheeran's story that other investigators have challenged, timing inconsistencies, details that don't align with witness accounts, the convenient vagueness about what happened to the body after the killing. But here's what I keep coming back to. Sheeran's confession wasn't primarily about facts. It was about weight. This was a man who had carried the knowledge of killing his friend for nearly 30 years. 3 decades of sitting across from Hoffa's family at events, of watching the annual news stories about the search for the body, of living inside the gap between what the world believed and what he knew. Sheeran's physical decline in his later years was dramatic. He went from a physically imposing man, 6'4", built like a refrigerator, to a frail, wheelchair-bound shadow. His confessor instincts didn't kick in when he felt guilty. They kicked in when his body could no longer sustain the energy required to maintain the lie. And this is something that appears across multiple deathbed confessions. The body keeps score. Suppressed truth doesn't vanish. It metabolizes. It becomes insomnia, or paranoia, or the kind of chronic stress that accelerates aging and disease. Frank Sheeran didn't decide to confess because he suddenly discovered a conscience. He confessed because carrying the secret was killing him faster than his actual diseases. When Scorsese turned the story into The Irishman in 2019, the film's most devastating scenes weren't the violence. They were the silence after. De Niro's Sheeran, old and alone in a nursing home, abandoned by the mob that used him, and estranged from the family that learned what he'd done. The final shot, an old man asking a nurse to leave his door slightly open because he can't stand being completely enclosed, is about the claustrophobia of secrets. The cell that Sheeran built for himself, one lie at a time, over 30 years. The phrase, "I heard you paint houses," became a cultural touchstone, a book title, a film title, an emblem of the organized crime era. But strip away the Hollywood glamour, and what you have is a euphemism. A way of saying, I kill people without saying it. And Sheeran's entire confession operates the same way. It's a man telling you what he did while constantly, almost instinctively, managing how you receive it. Because even in confessing, Sheeran was performing. He wasn't just unburdening himself. He was authoring his legacy, choosing to be remembered as the man who solved the Hoffa mystery, rather than simply another aging mob enforcer dying in obscurity. That's the thing about confessions. They look like surrender, but they're often the last exercise of control. Sheeran killed for an organization. The men in the next story killed for an ideology, and their confession, well, it came out. But justice had already decided it didn't matter. Now, before we move on, I want to linger on something that connects Diller, Hunt, and Sheeran in a way that isn't immediately obvious. All 3 men lived inside their secrets comfortably. That's the part that disturbs me most, not the crimes themselves, the comfort. Diller built a successful business. Hunt wrote spy novels and raised a family in Miami. Sheeran attended Teamsters events and socialized with people who knew Hoffa personally. These weren't men tormented by guilt. They were men who had integrated their secrets so deeply into their daily existence that the secrets became invisible, even to themselves. And that raises a question that most true crime narratives never ask. What does it take to live comfortably inside a lie for decades? Not days, not weeks. Decades. The answer, I think, isn't moral bankruptcy. It's compartmentalization. The human mind's extraordinary ability to build walls between what it knows and what it acknowledges. Diller could sit in his workshop, repairing a client's broken cuckoo clock, and 3 feet away from him would be the most famous stolen timepiece on Earth. And in that moment, he wasn't a thief. He was a clockmaker. The two identities coexisted without conflict because they occupied different rooms in his mind. Hunt could sit at his typewriter and write a spy novel, fiction, about the very things he'd done for real. And the act of fictionalizing his experience created a buffer between himself and the truth. He wasn't confessing. He was creating art. The stories were simultaneously true and not true, and that ambiguity was where Hunt lived for 40 years. Sheeran could watch the evening news, see another story about the search for Hoffa's body, and feel what? Not guilt exactly, more like the distant awareness of a storm system passing overhead. Something happening out there in the world of public narrative that had nothing to do with the private narrative inside his head. This capacity for compartmentalization is not, I should note, pathological. It's universal. Every human being alive does it, in smaller ways, every day. We all carry truths that we've cordoned off from our daily consciousness, not because they're criminal, but because acknowledging them would require changes we're not prepared to make. The difference between these 3 men and the rest of us isn't the mechanism, it's the scale. Diller compartmentalized a museum heist. Hunt compartmentalized knowledge of a presidential assassination. Sheeran compartmentalized murder. But the cognitive trick is the same one you use when you avoid thinking about that email you should have sent, or that apology you owe someone, or that decision you've been postponing, because the consequences are too uncomfortable to face. The deathbed confession isn't the moment when the compartment walls collapse. It's the moment when the person inside finally admits the walls were there at all. And there's one more thing worth noting about these 3 chapters, these 3 men, before we move into darker territory. Diller's story is, in a strange way, almost charming. A clockmaker who loved clocks too much. There's something fable-like about it, something that belongs in a story told to children about the dangers of possession and desire. Hunt's story is cerebral, intellectual, a puzzle inside a puzzle where the reliability of the narrator is the mystery, not just a feature of it. You can spend years debating whether Hunt told the truth, and the debate itself is more interesting than any definitive answer would be. Sheeran's story is visceral, physical. A man who killed his friend carried it for 30 years and then handed the burden to a writer who turned it into a book, which became a film, which became part of the collective mythology of American organized crime. The confession didn't just enter the historical record. It entered popular culture. It became entertainment. And there's something troubling about that. About a man's most terrible act becoming a 3.5-hour Netflix film. About Robert De Niro inhabiting Frank Sheeran's guilt while audiences eat popcorn. about the confession being consumed, digested, and metabolized by a culture that turns real human suffering into content. But that's what happens when secrets become stories. They're no longer owned by the person who carried them. They belong to everyone, and everyone uses them for their own purposes. The Clockmaker's Secret became a museum story about cultural heritage and the psychology of collecting. Hunt's Secret became a conspiracy story, another thread in the infinite tapestry of JFK theories. Sheeran's Secret became a Hollywood story, a canvas for A-list actors and an auteur director. The confession sets the truth free, but it doesn't control where the truth goes after that. Now, I said the next story would take us into darker territory, and it will. But not the kind of darkness that involves conspiracy or organized crime. A different kind. Older. More American. The kind of darkness that doesn't hide in shadows because it doesn't need to. The kind that stands in broad daylight, wearing white hoods, and tells you exactly what it intends to do. And then does it. And then confesses. And then walks free. Because the system, the same system that failed Fritz Moen, that abandoned Father Kobilovich, that covered up Ray Wood's role in Malcolm X's death, the same system looked at the confession and decided, through a technicality so absurd it reads like satire, that it didn't count. Here is the story of Willie Edwards, and it might be the most infuriating thing you hear tonight, or any night. Actually, let me back up even further, because to understand why the Willie Edwards case makes your blood boil, you need to understand the legal technicality that made the confession irrelevant. And to understand the technicality, you need to understand how the American legal system handles the relationship between charges and evidence. In most criminal cases, evidence, including confessions, is evaluated against existing charges. If you're charged with robbery and you confess to robbery, the confession supports the charge. Simple. But what happens when you confess to something you weren't charged with? That's not a hypothetical question. That's exactly what happened in the Willie Edwards case. And the answer the system provided was, in its own bureaucratic way, one of the most devastating sentences ever spoken in an American courtroom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Willie Edwards first, about who he was before he became a legal footnote and a case study in systemic failure. Willie Edwards Jr. was 24 years old in 1957. He lived in Montgomery, Alabama, a city that, 2 years earlier, had been the epicenter of the bus boycott that launched the modern civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., the Montgomery Improvement Association, the year-long boycott that ended with the Supreme Court declaring bus segregation unconstitutional. By 1957, the boycott was over, but the rage it had produced in certain white communities was not. If anything, the success of the boycott had intensified the fury. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been dormant in some parts of the South, was experiencing a resurgence, fueled by the perception that the federal government and the courts were forcing racial integration on communities that violently opposed it. Willie Edwards was a truck driver. He worked for Winn-Dixie, delivering groceries. He was married. He had children. He was by every account a quiet, hard-working man whose daily life intersected with the vast machinery of racial politics only in the sense that everything a black man did in 1957 Alabama was political, whether he wanted it to be or not. On a January night, Willie Edwards was driving across the Tyler Goodwin Bridge over the Alabama River, and at the bridge, he encountered members of the Ku Klux Klan. What happened next depends on which account you follow, but the core facts are not in dispute. The Klansmen stopped Willie Edwards. They accused him, falsely, as it turned out, of being involved with a white woman. They forced him, at gunpoint, to the railing of the bridge, and they made him jump. Willie Edwards's body was found in the Alabama River 3 months later. The cause of death was listed as drowning. No murder charges were filed. Think about that. A group of men force another man off a bridge at gunpoint. The man dies, and the system records it as drowning. Not murder, not even manslaughter. Drowning. As if Willie Edwards had wandered to the bridge on his own and slipped. For 19 years, that's where the story sat. A young black man, dead. A cause of death that told the truth about what killed him, water, while lying about why he was in the water. A family without answers. A community without justice. Then, in 1976, the case was reopened. New investigators, new political climate. The civil rights movement had changed the landscape enough that cases previously considered uninvestigable were being reconsidered. And the Klansmen confessed. Not all of them, and not willingly. But under investigation, multiple members of the Klan group that had been on the bridge that night confirmed what had happened. They confirmed that Willie Edwards had been forced to jump. They confirmed the racial motivation. They provided details that corroborated the physical evidence. They confessed to killing a man. And then a judge dismissed the case. The reason? And this is the part that should make you put down whatever you're holding, because your hands might tremble. The reason was a legal technicality. The original charge against the Klansmen was kidnapping. Not murder. Kidnapping. And the judge ruled that because the charge was kidnapping, the confession to the murder, the forced jump from the bridge, was irrelevant. The confession described a crime that wasn't charged, and you can't convict someone of a crime that isn't charged. The Klansmen walked free. Confessed killers. Free. No further charges were ever filed. No murder charges were brought. The system processed the confession, found it technically inadmissible for the existing charges, and closed the file. Willie Edwards's family fought for decades to have the case reconsidered. His daughter, Melinda Edwards Hines, became an advocate for justice in the case, pressing prosecutors and politicians to act. In 1997, 40 years after the murder, a new death certificate was finally issued, listing the cause of death as died as a result of being forced off of a bridge by Ku Klux Klan members. 40 years? To get the cause of death changed from drowning to murder? And still, no one was prosecuted. The confessed killers lived out their lives as free men. Some of them died before the death certificate was even changed. They died as free men who had confessed to killing a 24-year-old father and faced 0 legal consequences. This is the story that breaks the pattern. In every other confession we've discussed tonight, the deathbed revelation changed something. It exonerated Fritz Moen. It vindicated Father Kobilovich. It reopened the Malcolm X investigation. It added to the historical record about JFK. It solved the Hoffa mystery, at least according to one account. But Willie Edwards' killers confessed, and nothing happened. The system heard the truth, processed it, and decided through the machinery of legal procedure that it didn't matter. And that's the most disturbing thing about this story. Not the violence, although the violence is monstrous. Not the racism, although the racism is foundational. The most disturbing thing is the system's response to the confession, because the system didn't say the confession was false. It didn't challenge the facts. It didn't dispute what happened on that bridge. It said, yes, this happened, and no, it doesn't count. The confession was true, and it was irrelevant. That distinction between truth and relevance is one of the most dangerous ideas the legal system has ever produced, because it means that truth, on its own, has no power. Truth only matters when it aligns with the procedural requirements of the system processing it. And those procedural requirements are designed by the same power structures that committed or enabled the original wrong. Willie Edwards' killers confessed and walked free, and the next man we'll meet committed his crime and walked free too, for 52 years. But his story is different, because Ted Conrad didn't hurt anyone. He didn't kill anyone. He stole $216,000 from a bank vault, walked out the front door, and became someone else entirely. And the question his story raises isn't about justice or morality, it's about identity itself. About whether a man who reinvents himself so completely that even his family doesn't know who he really is, has actually become the person he's pretending to be. Let me pause here for a moment, because I realize we've covered 6 confessions. 7 if you count Willie Edwards, whose story I just began. And a pattern has emerged that I want to name explicitly before we continue. Every confession so far has involved the relationship between the confessor and the institution. Fritz Moen's real killer confessed to a crime the Norwegian justice system had already solved. Father Kobilovich's accuser confessed to destroying a man the church had already abandoned. Ray Wood confessed to serving an institution, the NYPD, that had weaponized his loyalty. Norman Diller confessed to stealing from an institution, the museum, that couldn't appreciate what it held the way he could. E. Howard Hunt confessed to operating inside an institution, the CIA, whose secrecy made his claims simultaneously plausible and unverifiable. Frank Sheeran confessed to killing for an institution, the Bufalino crime family, that valued organizational loyalty over personal friendship. And Willie Edwards' killers confessed inside an institutional framework, the legal system, that processed their confession and found it procedurally irrelevant. The pattern is this. Deathbed confessions don't operate in a vacuum. They enter a world already structured by institutional power. And the institution's response to the confession determines its impact far more than the content of the confession itself. The truth, it turns out, is not self-executing. It doesn't arrive with the force of gravity, pulling everything into alignment. It arrives like a document, and documents need someone to file them, someone to read them, and a system willing to act on what they contain. Without all three of those conditions, a confession is just noise. We're now past the halfway point of our evening together. 6 stories deep. 6 confessions that reveal as much about the systems that received them as about the people who made them. And the next 3 stories, Ted Conrad, Patrick Carr, and Julian Altman, are going to shift the ground under your feet again. Because these aren't stories about institutions failing or power being abused. These are stories about identity, about what it means to become someone else, about the thin, almost theoretical line between who you are and who you pretend to be. Ted Conrad pretended to be Thomas Randele for 52 years. Was that a lie? Or was it a second life, one that might have been more authentic than the first? Patrick Carr's dying words defined legal truth in American courts for 2.5 centuries. Was he telling the truth, or was he telling the version of truth that the men standing over his deathbed wanted to hear? Julian Altman played a stolen Stradivarius for decades. Was he a thief, or the violin's most devoted caretaker? These questions don't have clean answers. And that, I think, is why these stories last. Not because they're dramatic, although they are, but because they force you to confront the possibility that truth itself is less stable than you thought. That's a frightening idea, but it's also strangely freeing. Because if truth is constructed, if it's something we build rather than something we find, then the act of confession isn't just about revealing what happened. It's about choosing which version of reality survives. Let me start with Ted Conrad, because his story asks the most unsettling version of that question. If a man lives a lie so completely that even he forgets it's a lie, is it still a lie? Now, before we get to Ted Conrad, I want to return to something that's been nagging at me since we left Naaman Diller's story, because there's a detail I didn't fully explore, and it matters for understanding everything that comes next. When Diller died and his wife discovered what was in their home, over 100 stolen timepieces, including the Marie Antoinette watch, she had a choice. She could have kept them. She could have sold them. She could have destroyed them. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody would have known. She chose to return them. And I think that choice reveals something important about the difference between the confessor and the people who received the confession. Diller's conscience, such as it was, operated on his own timeline. He kept the watches for decades and only acknowledged them in death. But his wife's conscience operated immediately. She learned the truth and acted on it. That's the asymmetry we keep encountering. The person who holds the secret gets to choose when and whether to release it. But the person who receives the secret doesn't get that luxury. Once you know, you know. And knowing creates an obligation that the original secret keeper could defer indefinitely. Diller deferred for 23 years. His wife resolved it in days. This dynamic, the deferral of the guilty versus the urgency of the innocent, is the engine that drives every deathbed confession story. And it's particularly acute in the stories we're about to tell, because Ted Conrad didn't just defer a confession. He deferred his entire identity. For 52 years, the longest vanishing act in American criminal history, he was simultaneously Ted Conrad and Thomas Randele. Two people occupying the same body. One of them, a 20-year-old bank thief from Cleveland. The other, a middle-aged businessman, husband, and father from the suburbs of Boston. And the question that haunts his story isn't, how did he get away with it? That's the true crime question, the procedural question, the question that U.S. Marshals spent 5 decades trying to answer. The question that haunts his story is, which one was real? Was Thomas Randele a mask that Ted Conrad wore? Or was Ted Conrad a skin that Thomas Randele shed? When his daughter called him Dad, who was she talking to? When his wife said, "I love you," who was she loving? These aren't philosophical abstractions. These are the kinds of questions that drove Ted Conrad's story from true crime into something closer to existential crisis. Because identity, it turns out, isn't a fixed property. It's a practice, something you do every day. And if you practice being someone else for 52 years, at some point, the practice becomes the truth. Or does it? That's what the next chapter is about. The longest lie in American criminal history, and the man who may, or may not, have forgotten it was a lie at all. But first, and this is important, I want you to notice something about the emotional trajectory of tonight's episode so far. We started with devastation, Fritz Moen, Father Kobilovich. 2 stories of institutional failure crushing the innocent. Then Malcolm X, the largest-scale institutional conspiracy we've covered, with consequences that rippled for half a century. Then we shifted. Diller's clock heist was lighter, almost whimsical in its way. A palate cleanser, a reminder that not all secrets are born from malice. Then Hunt and Sheeran pulled us back into darker territory, espionage, organized crime, the machinery of institutional violence, and then Willie Edwards shattered whatever equilibrium remained. A confession that the system decided didn't count. That's not random. That pacing, heavy, heavier, heaviest, pause, rebuild, pivot, devastate, is deliberate, because the human mind can't sustain maximum intensity for 2 hours. It needs rhythm. It needs variation. It needs moments of relative lightness to make the heavy moments land harder. And the next 3 chapters are going to do exactly that. Ted Conrad's story is genuinely entertaining. There's a 20-year-old inspired by Steve McQueen walking out of a bank with a paper bag full of cash. It's cinematic. It's fun. It almost makes you root for the guy. Patrick Carr's story is historical. It has the weight of centuries and the strangeness of a dying man forgiving the soldiers who shot him. It's intellectual, more than emotional. And Julian Altman's story is beautiful. A stolen Stradivarius, played in secret for decades, finally returned when its caretaker could no longer hold the bow. It's poignant in a way that the earlier stories aren't. There's something almost tender about it. These 3 stories are the ramp, the runway, the slow build toward the story you've been waiting for since the cold open. The story of the forger who fooled the Nazis, the courtroom painting, the confession that saved a life by admitting to the greatest art fraud in history. Han van Meegeren is the finale for a reason. His story has everything: stakes, spectacle, irony, humor, and a twist so perfectly constructed that if you read it in a novel, you'd call it unrealistic. But it happened. Every word of it happened. So settle in. We're not done yet. Not even close. (1969) Cleveland, Ohio. A city that had just watched its river catch fire. The Cuyahoga, so polluted with oil and industrial waste that it literally burned and was quietly dying the way Rust Belt cities die, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow hemorrhage of jobs, people, and hope. Ted Conrad was 20 years old. He worked as a vault teller at Society National Bank, a solid, respectable Cleveland institution, where the marble floors and brass fixtures whispered of old money and the kind of stability that the rest of the city was rapidly losing. As a vault teller, Conrad had access to extraordinary amounts of cash. Not his cash, the bank's cash, other people's cash, cash that he handled every day with the practiced indifference of a man dealing cards. Count it, stack it, record it, lock it up. Routine, boring, mind-numbing, until it wasn't, because Ted Conrad had recently watched a film. The Thomas Crown Affair, starring Steve McQueen. A slick, cool, impossibly stylish heist film in which a wealthy businessman robs a bank not because he needs the money, but because he can. Because the challenge itself, the audacity, the planning, the elegance of execution is the point. Now, most people watch The Thomas Crown Affair and think, what a great movie. Ted Conrad watched The Thomas Crown Affair and thought, I could do that. Not the elaborate multi-person heist with diversionary tactics and getaway cars. Something simpler, something that relied not on complexity, but on the complete absence of drama. Because Ted Conrad's inside, and it was in its own criminal way genuinely brilliant, was that the best heist isn't the one with the most elaborate plan. It's the one that doesn't look like a heist at all. On a Friday afternoon in July 1969, Ted Conrad put $216,000 in a paper bag. Not a briefcase, not a duffel bag, a paper bag, the kind you'd use to carry groceries. And he walked out the front door. No weapons, no masks, no accomplices, no alarm bypassing, no safe cracking. He just left. With a paper bag that contained, in today's dollars, approximately $1.8 million. The theft wasn't discovered until Monday. By then, Ted Conrad was gone. Not hiding in a motel outside Cleveland. Not driving to Mexico. Gone. As if he'd never existed. Because that, in a sense, is exactly what happened. Ted Conrad stopped existing. And Thomas Randele was born. The U.S. Marshals were assigned the case. They were confident. How far can a 20-year-old bank teller run with a paper bag? He had no resources, no connections, no network. He was a kid from Cleveland who'd pulled off an impulsive heist inspired by a Steve McQueen movie. They never found him, not that year, not that decade, not the next decade, not for 52 years. The case became a kind of legend. Within the U.S. Marshals Service, the file was passed from one marshal to the next, like an inheritance. The original investigating marshal, John Elliott, worked the case until he retired. And then his son, Pete Elliott, became a U.S. Marshal and inherited his father's obsession. Think about that for a moment. A hunt that spanned 2 generations of the same family. Father to son, like a grudge in a Shakespearean tragedy. John Elliott never caught Ted Conrad. He died knowing that the kid from Cleveland had beaten him. And Pete Elliott grew up hearing about the case, absorbing his father's frustration, and eventually dedicating his own career to finishing what his father started. Meanwhile, in Linfield, Massachusetts, a quiet suburb north of Boston, Thomas Randele was living a life so unremarkable that its very ordinariness was its camouflage. He married. He had a daughter. He ran businesses, a golf shop, then a car dealership. He paid his taxes. He joined the community. He went to barbecues and school events and town meetings. He was, by every observable metric, a decent, responsible, productive citizen for 52 years. Think about the architecture of that deception, not the dramatic parts, not the initial escape or the identity change. Think about the daily maintenance. Every morning, Thomas Randele woke up and chose to be Thomas Randele. Every introduction, every handshake, every form filled out, every conversation with his wife and daughter, all of it was an act. Or was it? Because here's the question that Conrad's story forces you to confront. If you live as someone else for 52 years, longer than most marriages, longer than most careers, longer than most people's adult lives, at what point does the performance become the reality? Thomas Randele wasn't pretending to love his wife. He loved her. He wasn't pretending to care about his daughter. He cared about her. He wasn't pretending to be a member of his community. He was a member of his community. The relationships were real. The emotions were real. The life was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the name on the birth certificate. In 2021, Pete Elliott finally cracked the case. The details of how he tracked Conrad down are, in their own way, as fascinating as the original heist, involving genealogical research, social media analysis, and the kind of patient, methodical detective work that only an obsessive could sustain across decades. When the marshals arrived at Thomas Randele's home, he was dying of lung cancer. He was in his 70s. He had lived an entire second life, a complete, full, legitimate life that was about to be retroactively rewritten. According to reports, when Randele's identity was confirmed, his family was devastated. Not by the crime, a bank theft from 1969, while technically unresolved, wasn't the kind of revelation that changes how you feel about your father. They were devastated by the deception, by the realization that the man they loved had carried a secret for longer than any of them had been alive. Conrad Randele died shortly after being identified. Whether you call it a deathbed confession or a deathbed revelation depends on your perspective. He didn't volunteer the information. He was found. But the timing, the identification coming just as his body was failing, gave his unmasking the same quality as a confession, a truth emerging only when concealment was no longer possible. And there's one detail from the final days that I can't stop thinking about. According to reports, when the family learned the truth, Conrad's wife asked him about it. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect of, "My name is Ted." After 52 years as Thomas Randele, he acknowledged Ted Conrad, not with guilt, not with relief, with a kind of simple factual statement, as if introducing himself to someone he'd met a long time ago and hadn't seen since. "My name is Ted." 4 words that collapsed 52 years of careful construction. 4 words that retroactively reframed every moment of Thomas Randele's life. Every birthday party, every business deal, every quiet evening with his wife, as scenes in a performance that no one in the audience knew they were watching. But were they a performance? Or were they just life? Is identity the name on the certificate? Or is it the accumulated weight of every choice, every relationship, every ordinary Tuesday lived under that name? Ted Conrad stole $216,000. Thomas Randele paid his taxes for 52 years. Which man is the real one? I don't think there's a clean answer, and I don't think the story needs one. What it needs is the acknowledgement that identity is not a fixed thing. It's a practice, a daily choice. And for 52 years, Ted Conrad chose to be Thomas Randele. And Thomas Randele was, by most accounts, a good man. The bank got its money's worth in insurance. The marshals got their closure. Conrad's family got a truth they never asked for. And somewhere in the gap between Ted and Thomas, between the 20-year-old who walked out of a bank with a paper bag and the 71-year-old who died in a suburb of Boston, there's a story about what it means to be anyone at all. Ted Conrad reinvented himself so completely that even his family didn't know who he really was. But the next confession takes us back centuries, to a dying man whose final words literally changed the course of American law. March 5th, 1770, Boston, Massachusetts. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. In the snow outside the Custom House on King Street, 5 men lay dead or dying. British soldiers, young, frightened, outnumbered, pelted with ice and debris by an angry crowd, had fired into the mob. The shots lasted less than a minute. The consequences would last forever. The Boston Massacre, one of the defining events in the narrative of American independence. A moment that would be immortalized by Paul Revere's engraving, a dramatic and deliberately misleading image of disciplined soldiers firing on helpless civilians. Among the wounded was an Irishman named Patrick Carr. He was 30 years old, an immigrant, a leather worker by trade. He'd come to King Street that night, along with hundreds of other Bostonians, drawn by the commotion, the crowd, and the sense that something important was about to happen. Patrick Carr was hit by a musket ball. The wound was severe, but not immediately fatal. He lingered for 9 days, attended by physicians whose own loyalties and agendas would later become relevant to the story. 9 days is a long time to die. Long enough for the pain to become familiar. Long enough for the initial shock to fade and something else to take its place. A strange clarity that sometimes accompanies the slow approach of death. A willingness to speak without calculation, because calculation requires a future, and the dying have none. What Patrick Carr said during those 9 days changed the legal landscape of America. Not because he named conspirators or revealed institutional corruption, because he forgave. Carr told his physicians, and this testimony was later presented in court, that the soldiers had been provoked, that the crowd had been the aggressor, that the soldiers, surrounded and pelted with objects, had acted in what a reasonable person would call self-defense. A victim defending his killers? from his deathbed. Now, understand the political context. The Boston Massacre was already being weaponized by the colonial independence movement. Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and other revolutionary leaders were framing the event as proof of British tyranny, evidence that the Crown's soldiers were occupying Boston and murdering its citizens with impunity. Patrick Carr's dying declaration contradicted that narrative entirely. It said the soldiers were scared, the crowd was violent. The shooting, while tragic, was not an act of tyranny. It was an act of desperation. And this is where it gets legally fascinating. Because the defense attorney for the British soldiers, the man who would use Carr's words to secure their acquittal, was John Adams. Yes, that John Adams, future President of the United States, one of the architects of American independence. A man who believed deeply in the revolutionary cause, and who, nevertheless, chose to defend the soldiers who had killed 5 Bostonians. Adams's decision to take the case is in itself one of the great moral stories in American legal history. He knew it would be unpopular. He knew it would threaten his political career. He took it anyway, because he believed that the principle of fair trial, even for the hated, even for the enemy, was more important than political convenience. And Patrick Carr's dying declaration gave Adams his strongest piece of evidence. Because dying declarations occupied a unique position in English common law, they were considered inherently trustworthy, admissible as evidence in court, based on the legal assumption that a person on the verge of death has no reason to lie. The theory was theological at its core. A dying person, facing imminent judgment before God, would not add perjury to their sins. It's a beautiful theory. It's also, when you think about it, completely unverifiable. We have no way of knowing whether Patrick Carr was telling the truth, or telling the truth as he understood it, filtered through 9 days of pain, medication, and the influence of the physician standing over him. Because here's the detail that rarely makes it into the heroic version of this story. Carr's physicians were not neutral observers. They had their own political positions, their own relationships with the British military establishment, their own reasons to encourage a dying man to say certain things rather than others. Did they lead Carr's testimony? We'll never know. The dead can't be cross-examined. That's the very nature of dying declarations. They're accepted as truth precisely because the alternative, calling a dead man a liar, feels morally repugnant. And that principle, that dying declarations are admissible because death confers a kind of credibility, has survived in American law for over 250 years. It's codified in the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 804b. 2. It's been cited in thousands of cases. It's one of the exceptions to the hearsay rule that every law student learns in their first year. All because Patrick Carr, dying in a Boston bedroom in March 1770, said something that the legal system decided to believe. Was he right? Were the soldiers provoked? Historians have debated this for centuries, and the consensus is complicated. The crowd was aggressive. The soldiers were frightened. But the chain of events that put those soldiers on that street, in that crowd, with loaded weapons, that was the product of colonial occupation and institutional decisions made far above the pay grade of anyone who pulled a trigger that night. Patrick Carr forgave the soldiers, But the question of whether there was anything to forgive, or whether the real guilt belonged to the institutions that created the conditions for the massacre, that's a question his dying declaration couldn't answer. And it's a question that, 256 years later, we're still not sure we've answered either. Patrick Carr's dying words established a legal principle. But the next confession isn't about law or justice. It's about something more intimate, a stolen instrument that sang for the wrong master for decades. There's something about a Stradivarius that resists rational discussion. The instruments, made by Antonio Stradivari in his workshop in Cremona, Italy, between roughly 1666 and 1737, are, by any objective measurement, the pinnacle of stringed instrument construction. Their sound has been analyzed, spectrographed, blind-tested, and debated for 3 centuries. Scientists have studied the wood, the varnish, the geometry, the density. They've hypothesized about the Little Ice Age changing the grain of the spruce trees. They've proposed chemical treatments, fungal modifications, mineral deposits in the Italian water supply. And still, nobody can fully explain why a Stradivarius sounds the way it does, or replicate it. 300 years of technological advancement, mass spectrometry, computer modeling, acoustic engineering, and the best we can do is admire, not duplicate. There are approximately 650 Stradivari instruments known to exist today. Of those, about 450 are violins. Each one has a name, a history, and a value measured in millions. They're played by the world's greatest soloists, held in museums, insured for sums that would fund small governments. In 1936, one of them was stolen. The violin belonged to Bronislaw Huberman, a Polish virtuoso who was, at the time, one of the most celebrated violinists in the world. Huberman's Stradivarius, a 1713 instrument known as the Gibson X Huberman, had been his companion for years. He played it in concert halls across Europe and America. It was, in every meaningful sense, an extension of his body, the instrument through which his musical ideas became sound. On February 28th, 1936, Huberman performed at Carnegie Hall in New York City. After the concert, he left his violin backstage. When he returned, it was gone. The theft was headline news. Carnegie Hall, Huberman, a Stradivarius. The combination of elements was so dramatically perfect that it read like the plot of a detective novel. The NYPD investigated. Insurance claims were filed. The violin world mourned. And then, silence. The instrument vanished as completely as Ted Conrad would vanish 33 years later. No ransom demands, no underground sales, no sightings. The Gibson X Huberman simply ceased to exist in the public record. But it didn't cease to exist. It continued to be played, quietly, in smaller venues, by a violinist named Julian Altman. Altman was not a name that appeared on the marquees of Carnegie Hall. He was a competent, professional musician, the kind who makes a living in orchestras and session work, respected by colleagues, but unknown to the general public. The kind of violinist who could walk into any concert hall in America and be hired, and walk out again without anyone remembering his face. The perfect violinist, in other words, to hide a stolen instrument. Because the genius of Altman's theft, if he was indeed the original thief, which remains debated, wasn't in the stealing. It was in the using. A stolen Stradivarius locked in a vault is simultaneously priceless and worthless. It can't be sold without being identified. It can't be displayed without being recognized. It can only sit in the dark, its potential unrealized, its voice silenced. But a stolen Stradivarius played in public by a professional musician in the context of ordinary performances, that's invisible. Because nobody expects a journeyman violinist to be playing a $3 million instrument. The violin hides in plain sight, not through concealment, but through the audience's assumptions about who deserves to play such a thing. And Altman played it for decades. Nearly 50 years, through orchestral performances, recording sessions, and private concerts. The instrument that had been made by Stradivari in 1713, played by Huberman at Carnegie Hall in 1936, and stolen that same night, was performing in venues across America under a different musician's name. Think about what that means. Every audience member who heard Altman play was hearing a Stradivarius, hearing, arguably, one of the most beautiful sounds a human being can produce, without knowing it. They were in the presence of something extraordinary and had no idea. The violin's provenance, its history, its stolenness, was irrelevant to the sound it made. The music didn't know it was stolen. And Altman? What was his experience? Playing an instrument he knew wasn't his, in front of audiences who didn't know what they were hearing? Was it exhilarating? Terrifying? Did the secret enhance the performances, giving them an edge of transgression, of forbidden intimacy, or did it corrode them? I imagine both, simultaneously. Because that's how secrets work. They give you something, and they take something. And the two processes happen at the same time, like breathing in and breathing out. Altman must have known every time he opened the case that he was looking at something that could destroy his career, his reputation, his freedom. And he must have known every time he drew the bow across the strings that the sound he was producing was unlike anything any other instrument could make. The risk and the reward were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other. His confession came, as these confessions do, at the end. Julian Altman, dying, told his wife about the violin. Not all the details. The story of how he acquired it remains murky, and different accounts offer different explanations. Some suggest he stole it himself from Carnegie Hall. Others suggest he purchased it from the actual thief, knowing its provenance. The truth, like the violin's sound, is a matter of interpretation. What's clear is that Altman's wife, upon learning the truth, returned the instrument. It was authenticated. The Gibson ex Huberman, the 1713 Stradivarius that had been missing for nearly 50 years. It was intact, in remarkable condition, because Julian Altman, whatever else he was a musician who understood the care that such an instrument demands. The violin eventually found its way to Joshua Bell, one of the world's greatest living violinists, who purchased it and plays it today. The instrument that Stradivari made in Cremona, that Huberman played at Carnegie Hall, that Altman played in secret for half a century, is now back in the light. Its voice, which was never truly silenced, now fills the concert halls it was always meant to fill. But I keep thinking about the years in between, the secret years, the years when the most famous missing violin in the world was being played. Openly, publicly, by a man who knew the truth about what he held. There's something almost sacred about that. Sacrilegious and sacred at the same time, because Altman didn't silence the Stradivarius. He didn't lock it away. He played it. He kept it alive. He maintained the relationship between instrument and musician that Stradivari intended when he shaped the wood 3 centuries earlier. Was he a thief? Absolutely. Was he also the instrument's most devoted caretaker? Possibly. Can both things be true simultaneously? In the world of deathbed confessions, I'm learning that the answer is almost always yes. Julian Altman stole one masterpiece and played it in secret, but the man in our final story, he didn't steal masterpieces, he created them. And his confession didn't save his reputation, it saved his life. There are certain hymns that feel as though they've always existed, as though they emerged from the collective unconscious of Western civilization, fully formed, needing no author, because they belong to everyone. Amazing Grace is one of those hymns. You've heard it at funerals, at weddings, in films, in moments of national mourning. It's been recorded thousands of times in every genre, from gospel to bagpipes. Its opening lines, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, are among the most recognized words in the English language. But that word, wretch, it wasn't metaphorical. The man who wrote those words, John Newton, was not speaking in generalities about the human condition. He was speaking about himself. Specifically, precisely. About what he had done, about who he had been. John Newton was a slave ship captain. For years, Newton commanded vessels that transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, the worst journey in human history. A weeks-long crossing in which hundreds of human beings were chained below decks in conditions so hellish that descriptions from the period read like dispatches from the underworld. Newton knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't a passive participant in a system he didn't understand. He was an operational manager of human trafficking. He supervised the loading of enslaved people. He maintained the ship's log. He managed the crew. He calculated the profit margins. And then, in 1748, during a violent storm at sea, something happened. What Newton described as a spiritual awakening, a moment of grace, of divine intervention, of the sudden and overwhelming awareness that he was, by any moral accounting, a monster. But here's the thing about Newton's confession. It didn't come immediately. It didn't come on a deathbed. It came in stages, spread across decades, and the gaps between those stages reveal something important about how people process moral reckoning. After his storm at sea conversion, Newton didn't immediately renounce the slave trade. He made several more voyages as captain, several more ships, several more middle passages. The conversion that would eventually produce Amazing Grace didn't stop him from continuing to profit from the very thing he would later call wretched. It took Newton years to fully disengage from the trade. He left seafaring in 1754, became a clergyman, and gradually, very gradually, began to speak publicly against slavery. Amazing Grace was written in 1772, 24 years after his conversion experience. But his most powerful act of confession didn't come until 1788, 40 years after the storm. That year, Newton published Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade, a pamphlet in which he described, in unflinching detail, what he had witnessed and participated in. The conditions on the ships, the treatment of the enslaved, the casual cruelty, the dehumanization. It was a full confession, not whispered on a deathbed, but printed and distributed to the public. And it was explicitly designed to serve the abolitionist cause, providing first-hand testimony from a participant in the trade itself. Newton's pamphlet was cited in parliamentary debates. It contributed to the growing body of evidence that would eventually lead to the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. John Newton died in 1807, the same year the act was passed, as if the universe had a sense of dramatic timing. But the story doesn't end there, because Amazing Grace, the hymn born from Newton's guilt, his conversion, his decades-long reckoning with his own monstrousness, became something far bigger than its author intended. It became an anthem of the very people Newton had enslaved. The hymn was adopted by African American communities, by enslaved people, by the descendants of people who had been transported on ships exactly like Newton's. The song that a slave trader wrote about his own moral awakening became one of the most important expressions of Black spiritual resilience in American history. The irony is staggering, and it raises a question that has no comfortable answer. Can art transcend the artist? Can a hymn written by a slaver become a genuine source of comfort and strength for the enslaved and their descendants? Can the beauty of the creation erase, or at least complicate, the horror of the Creator? I don't know. What I know is that Newton's confession, unlike most of the confessions in tonight's episode, wasn't a final act. It was a beginning. A 40-year process of reckoning that produced not just words of repentance, but political action, legal change, and a hymn that outlived its author by 2 centuries. Perhaps that's the difference between a deathbed confession and a lifetime confession. The deathbed version relieves the confessor. The lifetime version might actually change something. Here's a story that inverts everything we've discussed tonight. A story about a man who confessed on what he thought was his deathbed, and then survived. James Washington was in a hospital in Nashville, Tennessee in 2009. He was gravely ill. Doctors believed he was dying. And in what he expected to be his final hours, Washington did what so many of the people in tonight's episode have done. He unburdened himself. He confessed to murder. Specifically, he told a nurse that he had killed someone years earlier, a woman whose death had gone unsolved. He provided details, names, locations, the kind of specifics that a dying man offers when he believes accountability is no longer possible. And then James Washington did something deeply inconvenient. He got better. Not fully recovered, he remained in poor health, but well enough to realize that the confession he'd made in what he thought were his final moments was now a problem. A very serious, legally actionable problem. Washington tried to recant. He claimed he'd been delirious. He said the medications had affected his judgment. He argued that the confession shouldn't be admissible because it was made under extreme duress, the duress of believing he was dying. The court disagreed. James Washington was convicted of murder, based in significant part on the confession he'd made when he thought he was dying. Now, think about what this case does to the legal and moral framework we've been building all night. The entire premise of the dying declaration, the legal principle established by Patrick Carr's words in 1770, is that a dying person has no reason to lie. They're about to face their maker. They have nothing to gain from fabrication. Their proximity to death confers a kind of credibility that the living can't access. But James Washington survived. He crossed back over the threshold. He went from dying person with special credibility to living person who confessed to murder. And the legal system had to decide, does the confession still count? The answer was yes. And the reasoning is worth examining, because it reveals the contradiction at the heart of every deathbed confession. If dying declarations are trustworthy because the dying have no reason to lie, then what happens when the dying person becomes a living person who has every reason to lie? The recantation is as motivated as the original confession was supposedly unmotivated. Washington had no reason to confess when he thought he was dying, but he had every reason to recant when he realized he wasn't. The court's solution was essentially to trust the confession and distrust the recantation, to treat the deathbed version as the true version, and the survival version as self-interested revision. But is that right? We've spent tonight examining confessions from people who controlled their narratives to the very end, people who chose what to reveal and when to reveal it. If the deathbed confession is just another form of narrative control, as I've been arguing, then why should we trust it more than the recantation? The answer, I think, is that we want to trust it. We want to believe that death strips away pretense, that the final moments are at last honest. It's a comforting belief, the idea that somewhere in every person there's a truth that will eventually emerge. But James Washington's case suggests otherwise. It suggests that confession is situational, that what a person says depends not on their proximity to truth, but on their proximity to consequences. When consequences seemed impossible, when Washington believed he was dying, he confessed. When consequences became real, when he survived, he recanted. The truth didn't change. The circumstances did. And the confession followed the circumstances, not the truth. That's a disturbing thought. It means that every deathbed confession in tonight's episode, every one, might be less about honesty and more about the confessor's calculation that consequences are no longer possible. Not truth, opportunity. One final story, a small one. Quiet. The kind that would never make headlines, never become a film, never generate a Wikipedia page. But it might be the most haunting of them all. Harvey Richardson was a librarian in Liverpool, England. He lived alone. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man, polite, punctual, fond of books in the way that librarians are. He died in the 2010s, and when his belongings were sorted, someone found a leather satchel. Inside the satchel was a 9-page handwritten confession. Richardson had written, in careful, librarian-neat handwriting, a detailed account of a crime he had committed decades earlier. The specifics, which I'll keep general out of respect for the ongoing investigation, involved a death that had been ruled accidental or remained unsolved. The confession was not addressed to anyone. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a legal document. It was more like a journal entry. An extended, meticulous, almost compulsive recording of events, timelines, and his own state of mind during and after the act. DNA evidence eventually confirmed elements of Richardson's account. The confession was genuine. The quiet librarian had been carrying a secret for years, writing it down in private, keeping the written confession in a leather satchel that he apparently carried with him regularly. Now, here's what makes this story different from every other confession tonight. Richardson didn't confess to anyone. He didn't tell a nurse or a family member or a journalist. He wrote it down and kept it. The confession was simultaneously an act of honesty, putting the truth on paper, and an act of continued concealment, keeping that paper hidden. It's as if he needed to confess but couldn't bear to be heard, as if the act of writing the truth was enough to provide some measure of relief, even if no other human being would ever read it. And maybe that connects to Dr. Pennebaker's research, the same research we discussed at the beginning of tonight's episode. Expressive writing reduces psychological burden, not because it changes the external world, but because it changes the internal one. The act of externalizing a thought, putting it into words, giving it form outside your own head, creates a kind of distance between you and the thought. Richardson may not have known the science, but he intuited the mechanism. He wrote his confession not to communicate it, but to survive it. The leather satchel wasn't a message in a bottle. It was a pressure valve. The fact that the confession was eventually found, after his death, by strangers sorting through his belongings, was, in a sense, accidental. Richardson didn't plan for it to be discovered. He didn't leave instructions. The satchel was just there, among his books and his teacups and his tidy, solitary, secret-carrying life. It's the smallest story in tonight's episode. A librarian, a satchel, 9 pages. No courtrooms, no institutions, no politicians, no film adaptations. Just a man who wrote down the truth and couldn't quite bring himself to let anyone else see it. But in some ways, it's the most essential story, because it strips the deathbed confession down to its purest form. No audience, no legacy management, no institutional implications. Just a human being, alone with the weight of what they've done, trying to find a way to carry it. And choosing, in the end, the same method that every confessor in tonight's episode chose. Putting the truth into words, getting it out, even if only onto paper, even if only into a leather satchel in a quiet room in Liverpool. The weight doesn't disappear, but it shifts. Just enough, just barely enough to keep breathing. That's what confession is, finally. Not justice, not truth, not courage. Relief. The smallest, most human word in the language. And with that, we return to the ending. 14 confessions. 14 truths that couldn't stay buried. 14 people who discovered, each in their own way, that the weight of silence is heavier than the weight of speech. If there's one deathbed confession from the 21st century that rewrote the understanding of an entire cultural war, it belongs to a woman most Americans know only by a pseudonym, Norma McCorvey. Jane Roe, the plaintiff in Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that established a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. For decades, Roe v. Wade was the fault line of American politics. Pro-choice, pro-life. Two sides of an argument so deeply felt, so personally charged, so politically weaponized, that entire elections turned on the question of where a candidate stood. And at the center of it all, largely invisible, was Norma McCorvey, a woman whose pseudonymous role in the case had turned her into a symbol before she was old enough to understand what that meant. McCorvey's life after Roe versus Wade was tumultuous. She struggled with addiction, with poverty, with the particular kind of public attention that comes from being the face of a movement you didn't choose to lead. She lived in relative obscurity for years. And then, in 1995, she did something that sent shockwaves through the culture war. She converted to Christianity and publicly switched sides. Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe herself, became pro-life. She appeared at rallies. She testified before Congress. She became, for the anti-abortion movement, the ultimate validation. The woman at the center of the case that legalized abortion had seen the light and changed her mind. It was a powerful narrative, a conversion narrative. The most compelling evidence the pro-life movement could have asked for, proof that even the person who made abortion legal recognized it was wrong. For 22 years, that was the story. Until 2017, when a documentary filmmaker sat with Norma McCorvey as she was dying and asked her a simple question. And McCorvey answered. "It was all an act," she said. "I did it well, too. I am a good actress." The conversion, the rallies, the congressional testimony, the public embrace of the pro-life cause, all of it, according to McCorvey's final confession, was paid for. "Of course I was doing it for the paycheck," she said. She named figures. Approximately $456,000 paid to her by various anti-abortion organizations over the years in exchange for her public advocacy. The Reverend Rob Schenck, himself a former leader of the anti-abortion movement, corroborated McCorvey's account. He confirmed that payments had been made, that the conversion was at minimum financially incentivized, that the pro-life movement's greatest trophy was, in fact, a purchased performance. Now, before we rush to judgment, consider the complexity here. McCorvey was a complicated person. It's possible that her conversion was simultaneously genuine and financially motivated, that she believed what she was saying and was being paid to say it. Human motivation is rarely pure. We can hold contradictory beliefs and sincere convictions and financial self-interest all at the same time, without any of them being entirely false. But her deathbed framing was unambiguous. It was all an act. Those 5 words didn't leave much room for nuance, and they forced both sides of the abortion debate to reckon with a deeply uncomfortable question. For the pro-life movement, had they built a central piece of their public argument on a paid performance? Had they, in their desire for a compelling narrative, created the very thing they needed? A convert who wasn't converting at all, but acting? For the pro-choice movement, had they spent 22 years attacking McCorvey as a traitor when she was, in fact, a woman being exploited by organizations with deeper pockets than hers? And for everyone, what does it mean when the most consequential figures in a cultural war aren't believers, but performers. McCorvey's confession connects to the pattern we've been tracing all night. Like Hunt's JFK claims, it's a confession from someone with a complicated relationship to truth. Like Sheeran's Hoffa confession, it was delivered through media, a documentary designed for public consumption. Like Van Meegeren's courtroom painting, it was a performance about performance. But unlike those confessions, McCorvey's struck at something that millions of Americans held as a matter of personal faith and identity. This wasn't a historical mystery being solved or a crime being admitted. This was a living, breathing, politically active movement being told that one of its foundational narratives was purchased. The implications haven't fully settled yet. They may never settle. Because McCorvey's confession, like so many deathbed confessions, creates more questions than it answers. Was the conversion entirely fake or partly real? Were the payments bribes or compensation for genuine advocacy? Did McCorvey's final confession reflect her true feelings? Or was it, too, a performance? One last act of rebellion against the people who had used her? We'll never know. McCorvey died in 2017. She took the definitive answer with her. And both sides of the debate that defined her life continued to use her story, including her confession, in exactly the way that serves their argument best, which is perhaps the most depressing lesson of all. The confession was supposed to be the truth, the final word. But in the hands of institutional power, in this case, the power of political movements with billions of dollars and millions of supporters, even the truth gets absorbed, repackaged, and deployed as ammunition. The truth didn't set anyone free. It just gave both sides more to fight about. Lee Atwater was, by any measure, one of the most effective political operatives in American history. He managed George H.W. Bush's 1988 presidential campaign. He orchestrated the infamous Willie Horton ad. He was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. He was brilliant, ruthless, and, by his own eventual admission, willing to do whatever it took to win. In 1987, Atwater played a role in what may have been the most consequential act of political sabotage in modern American history, the destruction of Gary Hart's presidential campaign. Hart was the frontrunner for the 1988 Democratic nomination, young, charismatic, intellectually formidable. He was the kind of candidate who genuinely threatened the Republican establishment. Polls showed him beating George H.W. Bush in a general election matchup. And then came the photograph. Hart on a boat called Monkey Business with a woman named Donna Rice on his lap. The image destroyed Hart's campaign overnight. He withdrew from the race, and the Democratic nomination eventually went to Michael Dukakis, a far weaker candidate who lost to Bush in a landslide. The conventional narrative treats Hart's downfall as self-inflicted. He was having an affair. He was caught. He paid the price. But according to Lee Atwater's own account, delivered in a series of deathbed confessions as he was dying of brain cancer at the age of 40, the monkey business scandal wasn't an organic discovery. It was a setup, orchestrated by Republican operatives who understood that Hart was the one Democrat who could beat their candidate. Atwater, in his final months, apologized publicly to several people he had harmed throughout his career. His apologies were raw, emotional, and, to many who knew him, shockingly sincere. The man who had built his career on political destruction spent his final weeks trying to undo the damage. Whether his confessions were genuine acts of conscience or the desperate bargaining of a dying man is, of course, impossible to determine. Atwater himself acknowledged the paradox. He'd spent his life manipulating narratives. How could anyone, including himself, trust that his final narrative was authentic? But here's the detail that gives Hart's version of events its peculiar weight. When Hart was asked about Atwater's confession years later, his response was remarkable in its restraint. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." What he said was this: without the destruction of his candidacy, George H.W. Bush never becomes president. Without Bush's presidency, his son George W. Bush likely never enters politics at the level he did. Without George W. Bush's presidency, there is no Iraq War, no weapons of mass destruction claims, no Abu Ghraib, no ISIS. One photograph, one setup, and a chain of consequences that reshaped the world. That's the kind of historical domino effect that makes Deathbed Confessions so fascinating and so terrifying. Because confessions don't just reveal what happened, they reveal what could have happened differently. They open the door to alternate histories, parallel timelines, worlds that almost existed, but were derailed by a single act of deception. Lee Atwater's confession suggests that the 1988 election, and therefore the political trajectory of the next 30 years, was shaped not by democratic choice, but by political sabotage. One operative, one operation, one photograph on a boat, and the truth didn't come out until Atwater was dying of brain cancer at 40. Until the consequences of his actions had already calcified into history. Until the alternate timeline, the one where Gary Hart became president and the world took a different path, was sealed forever. That's the ultimate cost of the delayed confession, not just the immediate damage. The wrongful convictions, the stolen art, the murdered innocence. But the opportunity cost. The futures that never happened because the truth arrived too late to change anything. Every confession in tonight's episode arrived too late for something. Too late for Fritz Moen's life. Too late for Khalil Islam's freedom. Too late for Willie Edwards' dignity. Too late for Gary Hart's presidency. The confessors got their release. The world got the truth. But the world got it on their schedule. And by then, the damage was done. 16 confessions. 16 truths that couldn't stay buried. And 16 demonstrations of the same fundamental principle. The dying speak, but they speak too late. The truth arrives, but it arrives in the confessor's time, and justice. Justice waits. It always waits. For the paperwork, for the political will, for the institutional courage that institutions almost never find on their own. The confessions are done, the secrets are out. The weight has been lifted, from the confessors at least. For the rest of us, the weight just changed shape. It's knowledge now, the knowledge that truth is not a force of nature, it's a resource managed by the powerful, endured by the powerless, released only when the cost of holding it exceeds the cost of speaking it. And somewhere tonight, in a hospital bed, in a nursing home, In a quiet house at the end of a quiet street, someone is making that calculation. The cost of silence versus the cost of speech. The weight of the secret versus the weight of the confession. The comfort of control versus the relief of release. 16 people made that calculation before us. Some chose to speak. Some had the choice made for them. All of them, in the end, demonstrated the same truth. Secrets are heavier than coffins, and the only way out is through. And one more, because I can't leave you without telling you about the Loch Ness Monster. Stay with me. I know how that sounds, but this is a story about confession, about deception, and about the extraordinary persistence of a lie that was told for the most petty, most human, most completely relatable reason imaginable. Revenge. In 1934, a photograph appeared in the Daily Mail, one of Britain's most widely read newspapers. The image showed a long, serpentine neck rising from the dark waters of Loch Ness in Scotland. The creature, whatever it was, appeared to be looking toward the camera with what could charitably be described as prehistoric dignity. The photograph became, instantly and irrevocably, the most famous image of the Loch Ness Monster. It was reproduced millions of times. It launched an industry, a tourism, merchandise, and pseudoscientific investigation industry that would generate hundreds of millions of dollars over the following decades. It transformed a quiet Scottish lake into one of the most visited destinations on Earth. The photograph was known as the surgeon's photograph because it was attributed to a London physician named Robert Kenneth Wilson, who claimed to have taken it while driving along the shore of the loch. Wilson was a respectable man, a surgeon, a professional, exactly the kind of credible witness whose testimony would be taken seriously. For 60 years, the photograph was debated, analyzed, enhanced, and defended. Believers pointed to Wilson's professional standing. Skeptics pointed to the image's suspicious composition. The debate became its own cottage industry, feeding into the broader question of whether the Loch Ness Monster was real, imaginary, or something in between. And then, in 1994, a man named Christian Sperling, 90 years old, lying in a nursing home knowing he was dying, decided to tell the truth. The photograph was a hoax. Sperling, along with his stepfather Marmaduke Wetherell and Wilson himself, had staged the entire thing. The monster was a toy submarine with a sculpted head attached. They'd built it, photographed it, in the loch, and planted the image with the Daily Mail through Wilson, whose medical credentials provided the credibility the hoax needed to succeed. But here's the part that makes this story quintessentially human. The motivation wasn't fame. It wasn't money. Although the photograph certainly generated plenty of both over the years. The motivation was revenge. Marmaduke Wetherell had been hired by the Daily Mail in 1933 to find the Loch Ness Monster. When his initial expedition produced only hoax footprints, which turned out to have been made with a hippopotamus foot umbrella stand, the newspaper publicly humiliated him. They called him a fraud. They mocked his credibility. They turned him into a laughingstock. Wetherell was furious, and his fury, combined with his stepson's model-building skills and Wilson's willingness to play along, produced the most famous photograph of the 20th century's most famous cryptid. It was, at its core, a prank. An elaborate, meticulously executed, brilliantly sustained prank born from the most basic of human emotions, the desire to make the people who mocked you look stupid. And it worked, not just in the moment. For 60 years, 60 years of scientists, journalists, tourists, and true believers investing time, money, and credibility in the hunt for a creature whose most compelling evidence was a toy submarine in a Scottish lake. Christian Sperling's deathbed confession didn't just debunk a photograph, it debunked an entire industry. It retroactively transformed millions of pages of analysis, thousands of expeditions, and billions of tourist dollars into consequences of a 90-year-old grudge. And yet, and this is the beautiful part, it didn't matter. Not really. The Loch Ness tourism industry barely flinched. The monster hunters kept hunting. The gift shops kept selling. Because by 1994, the Loch Ness Monster had transcended evidence. It had become myth. And myths don't die when they're debunked. They just become more interesting. Sperling's confession revealed that the photograph was fake. But it couldn't prove that the monster didn't exist. The absence of one piece of evidence doesn't constitute the absence of the thing itself, and the believers understood this instinctively. The photograph may have been staged, but the lake is still there, and the lake is very, very deep. So the confession changed nothing and everything. It removed the foundation of the most persistent cryptozoological belief in Western culture, while somehow leaving the belief itself intact. The truth arrived. The myth absorbed it. And life, including Loch Ness tourism, went on. And now, at last, we return to the courtroom in Amsterdam, to the gaunt man with the trembling hands, to the 6 words that turned the art world upside down. I didn't sell a Vermeer, I painted it. Let me tell you the full story of Han van Meegeren, because it is, without exaggeration, the most extraordinary deathbed confession in history. And it begins, as all the best stories about deception begin, with rejection. Because before Han van Meegeren was the greatest forger who ever lived, he was just a painter who wanted to be loved, and art critics wouldn't let him. That detail matters more than anything else in this story, more than the forgeries, more than Goering, more than the courtroom painting. The engine that drove Han van Meegeren's entire criminal career was not greed, not thrill-seeking, not ideological conviction. It was spite, pure distilled, decades fermented, spite. Van Meegeren was born in 1889 in Deventer, Netherlands. He trained as an artist. He was technically gifted. His draftsmanship was superb. His understanding of light and color was sophisticated. His command of traditional techniques was exhaustive. He could paint. Nobody disputed that. What the critics disputed was whether his painting mattered, whether it had anything to say, whether it was art or merely craft. And in the art world of the early 20th century, a world being torn apart by cubism, surrealism, and the relentless avant-garde, merely craft was the most devastating assessment possible. Van Meegeren's work was dismissed as derivative, traditional, backward-looking, a competent reproduction of styles that had already been perfected centuries ago. The reviews crushed him, not financially. He could make a decent living from his technical skills, but spiritually. The thing that artists need more than money, more than recognition, more than success, The thing they need, like oxygen, is to be taken seriously. And the art establishment of the Netherlands had decided that Han van Meegeren was not a serious artist. So he decided to prove them wrong in the most elaborate, most audacious, most darkly funny way imaginable. He would paint a Vermeer. Not a copy of an existing Vermeer, a new Vermeer. A painting that never existed, attributed to the Dutch Old Master, authenticated by the very experts who had dismissed Van Meegeren's original work. And when the experts praised it, when they wrote their glowing assessments of its luminosity, its composition, its unmistakable Vermeerness, Van Meegeren would reveal the truth. He would prove that the critics who said he couldn't paint were the same critics who couldn't tell his painting from a masterpiece. The plan was brilliant. The execution was even more so. Van Meegeren spent years developing his technique. He studied Vermeer's pigments, his brushwork, his canvas preparation. He sourced 17th century canvases. He developed a method for artificially aging paint using bakelite, a synthetic resin, in his pigment mixture, so that the paint would harden like genuine 300-year-old oil paint when baked in an oven. His first major forgery, The Supper at Emmaus, appeared in 1937. It was discovered through carefully orchestrated channels and presented to Abraham Bredius, the preeminent Vermeer scholar in the world. Bredius examined it. He was overwhelmed. He declared it authentic. Not just authentic, the greatest Vermeer ever found. The painting was purchased by the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam for the equivalent of millions. And Van Meegeren didn't reveal the truth. That was the original plan, to unmask himself, to humiliate the critics, to prove his point in a blaze of vindication. But when the money came in, when the praise continued, when he realized he could keep going, the plan changed. Spite became greed. One forgery became two. Two became five. Five became a career. Over the next 7 years, Van Meegeren produced multiple Vermeers and De Hooks, each one accepted by the art establishment, each one sold for enormous sums. He became wealthy. He became a respected figure in the Dutch art world, ironically, not as a painter of his own work, but as a dealer and collector of works that were, in fact, his own work. The layers of deception are almost comedic. Van Meegeren was being praised by the same critics who had dismissed him, praised for paintings he'd made, attributed to an artist who'd been dead for 300 years. The revenge was so perfect that the victim didn't even know it was happening. And then the war ended, and everything went wrong. Or right, depending on your perspective. Because here's what happened. In the chaos of post-war Netherlands, a nation reckoning with collaboration, resistance, and the murky moral territory in between, investigators began tracking stolen Dutch art, and they traced one painting, Christ and the Adulteress, attributed to Vermeer, to an unusual buyer. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, had been one of the most voracious art collectors in Nazi-occupied Europe. His personal collection, assembled through a combination of purchase, confiscation, and outright looting, included thousands of works. Among them was this Vermeer, which he'd acquired through a chain of dealers that eventually led back to Han van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was arrested. The charge wasn't forgery, it was collaboration. specifically selling a Dutch national treasure, a genuine Vermeer, to the leader of the enemy. In post-war Netherlands, this was functionally treason. The punishment could be death. And that's when Van Meegeren found himself in the situation that would make him immortal. Not as an artist, not as a forger, as a confessor. Because his only defense against the treason charge was to admit to a different crime. If the painting was a forgery, if Van Meegeren had made it himself, then he hadn't sold a Dutch masterpiece to the Nazis. He'd swindled them. He'd taken Göring's money for a fake. And in a country that had spent 5 years under Nazi occupation, swindling a Nazi wasn't a crime. It was practically a public service. But the court wasn't going to take his word for it. Van Meegeren had every incentive to claim the paintings were forgeries. It was, literally, the difference between execution and a minor prison sentence. And the art experts who had authenticated his work as genuine Vermeers had their own reputations on the line. Admitting that they'd been fooled, that the world's leading scholars of Dutch Old Masters couldn't tell a modern forgery from a 17th century masterpiece, was professional suicide. So the court demanded proof, and Van Meegeren provided it in the most spectacular way imaginable. He painted another Vermeer in front of the court, under supervision, using the same techniques he'd developed over years of painstaking study. The painting was Jesus Among the Doctors. It took approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Van Meegeren, gaunt and ill with heart disease, painting in a courtroom, while judges, prosecutors, art experts, and journalists watched. 6 weeks of watching a dying man create, brush stroke by brush stroke, a painting that could have fooled the world's greatest experts, because it was fooling them. As Van Meegeren painted, the experts in the room had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They couldn't tell, in real time, whether what they were watching was a competent modern painting or something that genuinely captured Vermeer's essence. The act of creation and the act of forgery were, in the hands of someone with Van Meegeren's skill, indistinguishable. The painting was completed, the experts examined it, and the charges were dropped. Not all of them. Van Meegeren was convicted of forgery, which carried a sentence of 1 year in prison. But the treason charge, the death sentence, was gone, replaced by the public recognition that Han van Meegeren hadn't betrayed his country. He'd made a fool of its enemies. And overnight, Van Meegeren became a folk hero. The irony is so thick you could paint with it. The man who had spent his career being dismissed by the art establishment was now celebrated, not for his original work, not for his artistic vision, but for his ability to deceive. The very skill that made him a forger, his mastery of other artists' styles, was recast as genius. The critics who had said he was merely a craftsman, not a true artist, now marveled at the craftsmanship that had fooled them all. Van Meegeren savored it. Briefly, he died on December 30th, 1947, barely a month after his conviction. Heart disease finishing what spite, ambition, and decades of fraudulent painting had started. But what happened to Göring when he learned the painting was fake? That detail is almost too perfect to be real, but it is real. When Hermann Göring, sitting in his Nuremberg prison cell, awaiting trial for crimes against humanity, was informed that his beloved Vermeer was a forgery, witnesses reported that he looked, for the first time in the entire trial, genuinely shocked. A man who had been confronted with evidence of genocide, mass murder, and the systematic destruction of European civilization had maintained his composure. But learning that his painting was fake, that broke through the armor. He looked, one witness said, as if for the first time he discovered there was evil in the world. That might be the single greatest line in the history of art crime. A mass murderer, devastated not by the weight of his crimes, but by the realization that he'd been cheated, that his taste, the one thing his ego still clung to, had been fooled by a Dutch painter with a grudge. Van Meegeren had done what the Allied armies couldn't do. He'd wounded Goering's pride. And that is why this story closes the episode. Not because it's the most important confession, not because it carries the heaviest moral weight, but because it's the most human. Because at its core, it's a story about a man who was told he wasn't good enough and spent the rest of his life proving he was, in the wrong way, for the wrong reasons, with consequences that spiraled far beyond anything he intended, but proving it nonetheless. Han van Meegeren wanted to be remembered as an artist. He's remembered as a forger. He wanted to humiliate the critics. The critics are long forgotten. He wanted revenge. He got it, but in a form so twisted that the revenge became its own kind of trap. And his confession, the courtroom painting, the 6 weeks of creation under supervision, wasn't just a legal defense. It was a performance, his final performance. The last canvas of a man who had spent his life painting for audiences that didn't know they were watching. End. Which brings me, at last, to the final thought I want to leave you with tonight. 17 confessions. 17 truths that couldn't stay buried. From the most consequential, Ray Wood's letter about Malcolm X, to the most absurd, a toy submarine in a Scottish lake. From the most devastating, Willie Edwards's killers walking free, to the most strangely beautiful, Julian Altman's stolen Stradivarius, singing in secret for half a century. These stories span centuries, continents, and every conceivable register of human experience, crime and art, politics and music, justice and farce. But they share one thing. They all demonstrate that truth is not a property of the universe. It's a property of human decision. Someone has to choose to speak. Someone has to choose to listen. And someone has to choose to act. Without all three, the speaker, the listener, the actor, a confession is just sound. Waves in the air. Words on paper in a leather satchel. The 17 people in tonight's episode made the first choice. They spoke, some reluctantly, some theatrically, some with decades of guilt behind them, some with a grudge and a toy submarine. But they spoke. And now you've made the second choice. You've listened. The third choice, what to do with what you've heard, is yours. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe these are just stories, entertaining and strange and sad, but ultimately disconnected from the daily texture of your life. Or maybe there's something you've been carrying, something that sits a little heavier at night when the world goes quiet and the usual distractions fade away. Something that Dr. Pennebaker's research suggests you might want to write down, not for anyone else, just for yourself. A small confession, a few lines on a page, the weight shifting just slightly from inside to outside. You don't have to share it. Harvey Richardson never shared his. It was enough to write it, to make the truth exist somewhere outside his own mind. That's all confession is, in the end. Not justice, not absolution, not even honesty, really. Just the movement of a truth from one place to another, from inside to outside, from silence to sound, from a hospital bed to the world. The weight lifts, the breath comes easier, the sleep arrives, 9 minutes faster if the Baylor research is to be believed. And tomorrow, you wake up, as always, a little lighter, a little wiser, a little more aware of the truths that other people carry, and the ones you carry yourself. 17 confessions, 17 weights, finally set down. What about yours? Now, as we approach the end of tonight's journey, I want to address something that's been accumulating quietly beneath these stories. Something I haven't said directly, because Mr. Calder prefers to let the stories do the work. But tonight, I think it needs to be said. We live in a world of managed narratives. Every institution, every government, every corporation, every organization with power is at this moment managing a narrative, deciding which truths to release, which to defer, which to bury. Not because they're evil, because that's what institutions do. They manage information the way they manage budgets and personnel, strategically, in their own interest, on their own timeline. And somewhere inside those institutions are people, individual human beings with individual consciences. People who know things that the institution doesn't want known. People who carry the weight of that knowledge every day, in their commute, in their conversations, in the small hours when sleep won't come and the mind starts replaying the things that can't be unsaid because they were never said in the first place. Some of those people will carry their secrets to the grave. The silence will hold, the institution will survive, and whatever truth they carried will vanish with them as if it never existed. But some of them, a few, a brave or desperate or dying few, will do what the 17 people in tonight's episode did. They'll speak, they'll write, they'll record, they'll leave a letter or a tape or a 9-page confession in a leather satchel. And the truth will emerge, not on the victim's schedule, not on justice's schedule, on their schedule. Because that's how deathbed confessions work. The confessor controls the timing, always. But here's what gives me something close to hope. The truth, once released, is uncontrollable. Ray Wood meant to tell his family. His family told the world. Christian Sperling meant to settle an old score. His confession reshaped the history of cryptozoology. Van Meegeren meant to save his life. His confession made him a folk hero. Once the words are out, once the truth crosses the threshold from inside to outside, it belongs to everyone, and everyone uses it differently. Sometimes for justice, sometimes for entertainment, sometimes for nothing at all. But it's out. That's what matters. It's in the world. It's part of the record. And no institution, no power structure, no narrative manager can unsay what's been said. That's the power of confession. Not that it arrives in time. It almost never does. But that it arrives at all. That the weight becomes, eventually, too heavy for any human being to carry alone, that the truth, like water, finds a way out. Even if it takes decades, even if it takes a deathbed, even if it takes a 90-year-old man in a nursing home remembering a toy submarine in a Scottish lake, the truth finds a way out. Not because the universe demands it, not because justice is inevitable, but because human beings are not designed for permanent silence. We're built to tell stories, to share what we know, to unburden ourselves of what we carry, and in the very end, when the monitors are beeping and the morphine is doing its work, and the long, careful, exhausting project of keeping secrets is finally coming to a close, we do what we were built to do. We confess. Not for justice, not for the record, not for the victims or the institutions or the historical record. For ourselves. Because the weight has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go is out. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos, Sleep Now, Midnight Magnates, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.